Our valiant hero could never have imagined that, being a modest editor of a literary historical magazine, he could become a traveler through the sands of time. However, cruel fate somehow incredibly still transferred him to the world of cultivators. But even this was not the limit of his adventures, for the noble young man received a special heavenly gift, the Invincible death system. The essence of this magical modifier was that after the owner meets their mortal hour, they immediately inherit all the power stored in the system and ascend to the level of a supreme deity. However, suicidal behavior could not activate this divine function. It is obvious that the soul of our hero was filled with unspeakable joy from the realization that all he needed was for someone to take his life, then he would soar to heavenly heights as a supreme deity. However, suddenly the loyal servant approached the noble lord, who could not understand what his master was so deeply pondering when it was time for them to set off on a long journey. Bowing respectfully, the devoted servant reminded that a very important meeting was to take place today, and the gentleman responsible for the state seal must not be late for this meeting under any circumstances. And yes, in this amazing world, our hero was indeed responsible for the great imperial seal. Moreover, the noble young man inherited all the memories of the original owner of this mortal body. This world was very similar to the warring states period in which he once lived. At the top sat the great Emperor Zhou, with other kingdoms below. To appease the princes and feudal lords, all the lands were divided among 6 kingdoms. The cause of this entire deplorable situation was considered to be the ignorance and helplessness of the last few emperors, who completely neglected the policy of governing the state. By the present time, the state had reached a state of complete decline, and it was no longer possible to restore its former glory. The country was declining. The princes became extremely greedy and avaricious. Moreover, each of them was under the protection of the immortals and disregarded the ruling dynasty. Mr. Yi Nin remembered that today, everyone gathered, because the clan of the immortals Yuhua led the feudal princes to force the emperor to grant them lands. Among those who arrived was He Yuanwei, a man from the immortal clan, who explained to His Majesty that their clan only asks the wise ruler to grant them a title, and in return they will do their utmost to help and protect the great Zhou dynasty. However, it is obvious that the ruler Jimin Yue wished to know what would happen if he did not want to do this. He Yuanwei was quite surprised by the gentleman's refusal. He calmly explained that although they had certain merits, it was clearly not enough to crown them. After all, if they were made rulers just like that, the ministers would definitely not approve such decisions, and the common people would certainly rise up against such arbitrariness. The envoy was extremely surprised that the ruler was seriously talking about ministers and ordinary people. He loudly reminded that it is the immortals who embody both the ministers and the people. Moreover, Li Jia, whom they demand to crown, had outstanding merits, so it would be reasonable to crown him, and the ministers and everyone else would not object to such a wise decision. Lord Yi clearly saw how deeply the emperor was distressed, and could not believe that there was not a single person in the entire palace whom the nobleman could trust. The loyal servant explained that the emperor trusted only Liu Sheng, but when this man was needed most today, the ruler was not present. He had fallen ill and could not come to the palace. Moreover, if it were not for conspiracies and intrigues, the ruler would not ignore the country's politics and be lost in a cloud of dreams. Mr. Yi himself understood that if he were in his place, he would not dare to lead his country to prosperity, because if everything became too good, then the immortals would surely try to finish him off. At that moment, the emperor picked up the words of the officials who insisted that the immortals represented the entire people. But just then a letter arrived from the residents of Jingyan. Good minister of taxes should be a well-read person, but the old man before him was too stupid and ignorant. Lord Yi also reproached the old man for, being a court official, not thinking about the imperial court, instead preferring to join the rebels in forcing the sovereign to abdicate the throne. Because of this, in his eyes, this man was even worse than some kind of animal, an old thief and scoundrel. Yet this old man still dared to say something to him. In the end, our hero humiliated this old man so severely that he even started bleeding from the mouth. Having dealt with one opponent, the valiant Yi Nin was ready to move on to the next. However, unexpectedly, Prince Wei armed himself with his blade, reminding the insolent brat that he dared to kill a man even here inside the sacred palace. Our hero, of course, was surprised that such a shameless rebel decided to raise his sword in the imperial chambers. He looked like a true murderer. After that, the noble Yi Nin calmly approached the Lord Emperor himself, and suggested to the rebel to try to kill him, for without his death, the rebel would not be able to reach the emperor. The other servants, looking at Lord Yi, understood that they were also educated people, and should have acted the same in his place. Now Lord Yi demonstrated to them the true ideal of a devoted person. The emperor could not believe that there was such a noble keeper of the seal in the country, and he rejoiced that a loyal official who was not afraid of death had finally appeared in the empire. Since he ascended the throne, the ruler behaved restrained and patiently. But he never thought that anyone from his entourage would be capable of standing up in defense. Now he knew that he must keep this man close to him. However, he had to figure out how to do it without revealing all the state's secrets. At that moment, the ruler of the principality pressed the blade straight to the hero's neck and warned that he had the courage to kill him. However, our hero only smirked, looking at the steel of his sword, and did not understand why the man was still hesitating. Then the ruler realized that in his entire long life he had never met people who were not afraid of death. He even suspected that the boy was pretending to be so fearless, trying to gain fame. Therefore, he came closer and looked the guy straight in the eyes, promising that when Ening dies, no one will honor his memory. However, our hero calmly reminded that no one becomes unknown after death. History was proof of that. After all, the world knows many great people. Moreover, he was confident that for his loyalty and noble deeds, even mountains and rivers would sing the glory of his name. These words were truly fitting for some exalted sage, and not at all for a young lad responsible for guarding the seals. Many people walking around the palace heard these words, and the words were so profound that they even caused a resonance of celestial energy among the sages. The others understood that Confucianism had been under the pressure of immortals for too long. They had not heard such sacred words for many years, words that had not been spoken for 1,000 years. Previously, there were many Confucian scholars in their world who could destroy any evil with a single stroke of the pen. But now they found themselves in a sad situation, and although the noble Yi Nin was just a minor official before them, he turned out to be an incredibly brave and decisive man. He was destined to achieve great success, for in Confucianism it is rare to find such a courageous and knowledgeable husband, who is also so loyal to his state. Even He Yuanwei was amazed at how this kid invigorated all of Confucianism with just one sentence, and our valiant defender looked at his opponent, not understanding how long he would have to wait until he went mad and finally killed him. However, to the incredible shock of the noble husband, the ruler of the Wei Principality only laughed at the words of the brave official. Moreover, he calmly sheathed his blade, for his sword does not kill true heroes. Yet the prince still could not understand why this loyal servant defends the state of the empire, which was as inevitable as the change of day and night. The ruler suggested to the keeper of the seal to go serve as an official in his kingdom. Then he would be well taken care of. The august ruler was extremely surprised that this impudent fellow so boldly and brazenly lured away his people. But in the current situation, his state could not make any promises, even though such a talented scholar served in it. Therefore, the emperor could only hope that the loyal man would not leave him. And the noble guardian of the throne could not understand what was wrong with this prince. It seemed to him that he had already argued with him enough for him to kill him. In the end, our young defender had no choice but to loudly declare that he would never betray his homeland. The brave servant even ordered the king to kill him or quarter him. He still would not agree to work for the enemy. However, the prince could not understand why the keeper of the seal needed all this. Since his lord was too stupid and cowardly, they could not be compared at all. Then our loyal subject explained that he was born a commoner and only became an official thanks to the emperor's will. The noble young man decided to spend his whole life glorifying his sovereign and bravely give his life for this. It is obvious that the Son of Heaven was struck by the fact that the Lord was ready to die for him. And yet until today, the ruler did not even know the name of this loyal servant. The brave man did not deceive him, and he did not want to deceive such a loyal subject. Even if today he has to reveal all his trump cards, he will still try to keep this official close to him. The Tsar was struck by the loyalty of the throne's defender, after which he decided to withdraw. He no longer wished to participate in these disputes, and the valiant guard, of course, was surprised, thinking that the prince had serious problems with his head. After all, he behaved very arrogantly, and here he suddenly did not even hit the young official. At that moment, He Yuanwei was outraged by the behavior of the sealkeeper. He could not understand how such a petty, insignificant person dared to behave as if craving death. After that, he warned the impudent man that he had 3 seconds to hand over the seal, or there would be nothing left of him but bones. With his whip, the immortal struck his faithful servant in the face, causing a bleeding wound. The devoted servant anxiously looked around, realizing that his master was surely doomed, for he could not compete with the immortals. Even the sovereign ruler rose from his place, ordering these people not to cause the nobleman any more pain. However, the brave defender himself was struck by how some simpleton dared to threaten him. Approaching closer, the throne guard reminded He Yuanwei that all immortals were too ruthless and treated ordinary people like pigs. They simply refused to die, and besides, they outnumbered even the bandits. In his opinion, their clan was the only source of chaos in this entire world. Officials began discussing the words of the keeper of the seal. In some ways, this man was right. They understood that if the valiant man had defended his honor like this in the times of the great ancestor, he would surely have become another powerful Confucian. But, unfortunately, the loyal servant was not born in those blessed times. He Yuanwei at that time was clearly shocked by the audacity of the boy in front of him. After that, he lunged at the noble protector. It means they are going against the ruler himself. The loyal servant even burst into tears at these words, as it was incredibly touching that the master was ready to live and die with his subordinate. The valiant defender thought that the august lord had completely lost his mind by deciding to stand up for him. All this time, the brave servant tried to help the ruler find death, but he only ruined his plans for the long-awaited end. The nobleman tried to explain to his majesty that he was clearly overdoing it, but the ruler loudly declared that there was no need to worry anymore, for today no one would harm the loyal guard. And when He Yuanwei agreed to spare the young official out of respect for the emperor, the loyal subject finally realized that he had lost his precious chance to die. He Yuanwei at the same time explained his conditions. The sovereign lord must grant the Li family the title of duke and force this scoundrel to kneel before his clan for 7 days. But if the ruler does not fulfill these conditions and continues to insist on protecting the keeper of the seal, an accident may happen. Obviously, the Son of Heaven was struck by such impudence and immediately stomped his foot loudly in protest. However, at that moment he slipped and fell straight into the hands of his subordinate, and only then did the brave defender notice that the ruler was far too attractive for a man. He immediately recoiled in fear and screamed in terror. After that, looking at himself, the noble guardian thought that he might have seen in the ruler the allure of some hidden passion of the former owner of this body. The valiant man could not believe that apparently the former owner of this body preferred men. However, having seen these terrible faces around, he could confidently say that he remained the same, and the august ruler appealed to him solely because of his feminine beauty. Because of these thoughts, the loyal servant almost forgot about his main goal. Therefore, he loudly declared that his majesty should not worry about him, for the humble subject had long decided to stake his life for the empire. After that, he calmly explained to He Yuanwei that as soon as the sovereign lord grants the title of duke to the Li family, the great country of Zhou will lose all its possessions. And even if the keeper of the seal dies, he will not allow the emperor to go through with such a thing. As is known, rivers of blood are necessary for people to open their eyes, so the young defender decided to show this man the true path. Since ancient times, no person has managed to avoid death, but the main question is how many of them managed to die with a clear conscience. At that moment, our valiant guard noticed how his body brightly shone after his words, after which 2 tall pillars of light rose to the heavens, reaching straight into the sky. This meant only one thing: the ancient sages had finally returned. And this means that the great sage of Confucianism is about to appear, and the beginning of a new era is coming. The sages read about this in history books. 2 pillars symbolize the left and right prime ministers of the ancient great Zhou dynasty. Everyone was incredibly eager to find out who managed to attract the attention of not 1, but 2 sages at once. Moreover, upon hearing the lines that spread by the voice of a brave subject throughout the sky, the wise men realized that these words were worthy of being passed down from generation to generation. At this moment, the noble protector of the throne, engulfed in divine light, understood that his plan was completely ruined. However, for some unknown reason, the loyal servant felt as if he had become much stronger. At that moment, the valiant guard lunged at He Yuanwei, demanding that he kill him immediately if he did not agree with his sacred words. However, the man could do nothing, for the entire body of the brave defender was engulfed in righteous heavenly energy. However, He Yuanwei could not allow the boy's righteous energy to affect the spirits of the people, or else the immortal clans would be in mortal danger. Therefore, he decided to eliminate the problem at its root before the noble young man became strong enough. In the end, the immortal attacked the seal keeper again with his energy, directing it straight at his face. At that moment, all the people bowed, realizing that the young man had managed to summon righteous power. However, after He Yuanwei's attack, he immediately flew back, crashing into the table. Obviously, everyone was shocked, even the loyal servant himself, who did not know what had happened. However, approaching closer, the brave defender demanded that He Yuanwei stand up, since he still had not killed him. However, the man was so frightened that after these words, he breathed his last. At that moment, the officials realized that their country was facing a great disaster, for the supreme clan would certainly not leave He Yuanwei's death unpunished. Immediately, the prince of the kingdom approached the noble guard to deal with the daring boy. However, looking back over his shoulder, the ruler saw how many external observers and sages had gathered behind him. In the end, he had no choice but would not have allowed the owner of the House of the Spring Breeze and the secretary of the Secret Service to personally test him. In the end, Xia Qian had no choice but to order the maid to send a letter to this man on her behalf. At this time, our hero, together with Lo Sanyuan, approached closer to the stage where men admired the beauty of the women dancing for them. Luo Sanyuan hastily explained that a talent show was currently being held, as money and power alone were not enough to attract the attention of the Oiran. However, suddenly the maid interrupted the entire event, addressing the gentleman and indicating that the lady wished to invite someone to her. Everyone was extremely amazed to see that the lady serving her had truly gone to call one of the lucky ones. At that moment, the maid read the letter aloud. Very influential people. She was also amazed that the guy who played such a delightful composition was so young and handsome. Therefore, both were convinced that they must obtain each other in order to use for their own purposes. In the end, the evening of Nina in the House of the Spring Breeze continued. They sat at the table, drank, and enjoyed the dishes. And so Xia Qian decided to find out where the composition that Ye Ning performed earlier came from. However, he lied that it was just an old sheet music he had received in childhood. And obviously, the girl riding through the streets must have reached the gentleman. However, these rumors were spread only to confuse others. The whole matter was that Xia Qian was still an innocent maiden, and she did not want anyone to try to get her. At this moment, Yi Nin was confused, not believing that no one would truly kill him if he spent the night with this woman. He no longer understood why he was wasting time on these songs and feasts at all. Therefore, suddenly, when the girl reached out her tender hands to him, our hero easily pushed her away, after which he bowed respectfully and explained to Lady Xia Qian that it was already quite late. He needed to leave. At that moment, the girl herself tried to stop the gentleman. For although she did not know any of the high-ranking individuals, she could still be useful to him. The whole point is that she was a secret agent of the Principality of Kievan Rus. She infiltrated the capital to gather information about the Great Zhou and find talented people for Kievan Rus. At the moment, the legacy of the Great Zhou was quite turbulent, and power belonged to the party of traitors. Our hero, however, was an incredibly gifted person, so she suggested that he enter the service of Kievan Rus, and decided from that moment to simply call Kai Xianggao brother, and that is what they agreed upon. However, our hero suspected that his brother had some problems since he appeared in the control room. As it turned out, His Majesty decided to grant him the title of judge in the control chamber. He came here to take up his post. A Nin was surprised that the young man was also exiled here. It seemed he had somehow offended His Majesty. As it turned out, Kai Xianggao met the Emperor only twice and had no idea how he could have offended him. To be honest, at the moment he was quite upset. He wanted to quit and return to his hometown just to become a professor. Inin tried to comfort the young man who suffered from this self-satisfied and foolish emperor. The ruler had a very noble man in his hands, but he refused to find him a worthy role. And in the end, Kai Xianggao was forced to spend his efforts in such a god-forsaken place. Obviously, at this moment the emperor sneezed, feeling that someone was talking about him behind his back. He only hoped that Minister Yi Ning and Kai Xianggao could get along. After all, two geniuses should speak the same language. And if they support each other, their power will be very difficult to break. Kai Xianggao was very upset at that moment that they were not even given a chance to contribute to this country, despite all their zeal and ambitions. But Ye Ning asked his brother not to be sad, for even in the control chamber they could achieve great heights for their country. The valiant man said, "When the moment comes to go out to sea and break through the waves, when the time comes, he will spread his sails, cross the sea, and break through the waves." This literally meant that even if a person does not see their path now, they will create it with their own hands if it becomes necessary. Obviously, Kai Xianggao was struck by the depth of these words. Even a single line was capable of making a person feel a very overwhelming heroic spirit. Yining's talent had reached the level where he could deliver improvised literary speeches. Therefore, bowing, he admitted that he could only admire his brother's will. Moreover, as he knew, tomorrow the control chamber was supposed to open its doors, and Kai Xianggao would be watching how Ye Ning would demonstrate his skills to the others. Obviously, Yi Nin was surprised, as he heard for the first time that the chamber was supposed to open its doors. It turned out that tomorrow would be the great day of justice. On this sacred day, anyone who disagrees with unfair treatment can beat the complaint drum. Yi Nin realized, in this case he simply needed a friend's help. He asked to inform the townspeople. If they encounter lawlessness, tomorrow they can find him in the control chamber to resolve the matter. At this moment, the noble ranks of the control chamber were outraged, like enraged tigers in a cage, for this imperial upstart would not calm down and appeared before them every day. Moreover, even friends were amazed by such intense emotions of their comrade, and even believed that the young lord managed to ignite the warrior spirit of the man, just as a spark ignites a flame in dry grass. Moreover, although these were only rumors floating around the capital like autumn leaves, many had heard that this Lord Yi had an exceptionally good reputation. However, the officials only laughed, knowing that reputation means nothing within these grim walls of power. After all, they have all held their positions in this rotten system for quite some time. Moreover, even if Yi Ning was a person capable of doing his job, after he joins the control chamber, he will become exactly like them. It was implied that the nobleman would simply become the most ordinary idler. One of the men, still sitting at the table, upon hearing these sad words, decided to even drink away his sorrow. Drunk, he fell to the floor and rolling on the floor like a miserable worm, explained that in this world they had no hope left. They were forgotten idlers by everyone, and all they could do was await their demise in the control chamber. They decided that it would be best to simply forget about this gentleman Inina, because he patted her on the head and asked her to stay home and behave properly. However, she clung to the hero so tightly and was not going to let him go anywhere, like a faithful guardian at the gates. In the end, her behavior convinced the hero to take her with him, but he asked the girl to behave obediently, as befits a noble maiden. Soon they found themselves at the gates of the control chamber. However, they saw Kai Xianggao arguing there fiercely. He screamed and could not believe that the people he saw before him were officials of the control chamber, for this was a sacred place, and they drank wine here and held feasts as if in a brothel. Obviously, Xuan did not understand what was happening within these sacred walls, but the noble Yi suggested that they first quietly observe what was going on. At that time, Kai Xianggao was spinning like an enraged dragon, reminding people that there was no one like them in the great celestial empire. He simply called these people a disgrace to the dynasty. Peeking from the side, our hero was not at all surprised that these idiots skipped their duty every day. Apparently they lived to the fullest, as if it were the last day before the end of the world. At this moment, one of the men asked His Highness not to be so angry, as it would only harm his precious health. Moreover, he did not understand what they could do in such severe cold. How else to warm up but with wine and food? And all the officials supported the opinion of their leader, even suggesting that Kai Xianggao join them in this merry pastime. Then the noble Kai Xianggao realized that all was hopeless. In such a state, the control chamber had no hope of revival, like a withered lotus in a dried-up pond. But at that moment, Yi Nin noticed that one of the peasants had approached the control chamber. Therefore he, with a courteous gesture, worthy of a true official, asked the man to come inside. Then he calmly, bowing, explained that he had heard rumors that the honorable lord who works for the good of the people, like the legendary rulers of ancient times, was here. Obviously, the officials could not believe that this damned old man had uttered such nonsense. At first, the man was scared and even began to stutter, like a leaf in the wind. But then he confidently reminded that he had heard. The honorable gentleman should be here, and he came here to file a complaint, as the law of the Celestial Empire dictates. However, the officials rudely explained to the man that he had come to the wrong place. There were no honorable lords here, and no one worked for the good of the people, as if only darkness and desolation ruled in this place. However, Kai Xianggao ignored the words of these unworthy ones and, approaching the respected man, explained that if he had any complaints, the control chamber would surely help him uphold justice, as prescribed by the heavenly mandate. Yi Nin was very proud. As expected, the fire of justice burned in Kai Xianggao's soul. At that moment, the man cried bitterly, explaining that he was a simple woodcutter. After a long day of burning wood to produce charcoal, he wanted to bring it to the capital for sale. But someone stole his load as he was passing through the city gates, like a robber in broad daylight. The man had a sick wife who needed medicine, which he planned to buy with the money from selling coal. He first turned to the head of the city administration, but they refused to listen to him as if he were the poorest beggar. Then Kai Xianggao asked if he had contacted the Ministry of Justice, but as it turned out, the man was even refused entry as if he were leprous. Therefore, kneeling before the heavens, he tried to convince the lords that all suspicions of coal theft were directed at the supervisory eunuch Marquis Yan. Kai Xianggao knew perfectly well that this was the very marquis who had bought his title for silver. He remembered that his son was also the main candidate for training in the cultivation sect and had gone to the Jade Chamber. He feared that even the emperor himself was forced to interact with them very politely while in the capital, as if they possessed the power of dragons themselves. However, the man, falling to his knees, began to beg the honorable gentleman to restore justice for the unfortunate commoner. Obviously concerned, Kai Xianggao asked the man to get up from his knees. However, at that moment, the approaching official pushed Kai Xianggao aside, stepped closer to the peasant, and pointed the blade at his face. He ordered the old man to get out of here immediately. And when he did not move from his place, he stated that the old dog apparently craves death, since he behaves so boldly. At that moment, our hero appeared with a loud shout, warning that if the scoundrel even dared to touch this peasant, he must be ready for the consequences. Kai Xianggao was very pleased that Ye Ning had finally arrived here. At that moment, the man with the saber laughed, realizing that a novice censor had come to them. However, approaching, he decided to teach the hero a lesson so that he would no longer dare to behave so boldly. But at that moment, the scoundrel received a resounding slap on the face, putting the villain in his place. He was, of course, very surprised that someone like this young man dared to hit him. However, for his bold words, he received another slap. Moreover, the noble Yi called him a despicable pig. Right now, I wanted to tear the skin off this scoundrel, and squealing like a beaten pig, he decided to attack him in order to kill. But in the last moments he stopped, for he encountered the unwavering and not at all frightened gaze of the hero. Then the official thought that Yining underestimated him, believing that he was weak and could not kill him. However, our hero coldly pointed out to the man where the weak spots on the human body were, ordering him to aim directly there. Obviously, the official did not understand what was happening with this gentleman at all. He looked as if he was not afraid of death at all and even craved it. In the end, stabbing the blade into the ground, the official grumbled that he would definitely have finished off the hero if he had not been his superior. And at that moment, Nin unbuttoned his cloak and threw it to the ground. Now he was an ordinary man, so he ordered the scoundrel to fear nothing and prove the truth of his words. However, upon approaching, the nobleman honestly admitted that he considered this man simply a scoundrel. He had just behaved very impulsively, but now he began to doubt. At that moment, the scoundrel was completely outraged. After all, he and Yenin were colleagues. Yet he continued to humiliate him because of some miserable peasant. Obviously, our hero was outraged by his behavior and immediately grabbed this impudent fellow by the scruff. He had no idea how ordinary townspeople. Of course, they could easily oppress people, but they cannot hide their dark deeds from heaven. These words began to spread with a powerful resonance throughout the district. And these very words sank straight into the heart of the official standing before the hero. He realized that he had just heard the divine word, capable of making the power of the great Taizu, stored in the control chamber, resonate. Obviously, everyone was immensely amazed, for they truly managed to gain the recognition of the very sage. The official realized that Nin is a truly noble and honest person, different from worthless sycophants. But even now, few wanted to tarnish the honor of the powerful Marquis for some cart of coal. In the eyes of people like the Marquis, they were also nothing more than miserable peasants, which is why they could not really do anything. At that moment, the young maid approached her master, lifted his cloak and held it in her hands. Immediately fastening it, the nobleman loudly announced to the whole world that he was going to the Marquis's residence to immediately arrest that scoundrel. He hoped that these people would have the courage to follow him, but none of the officials Marquis. However, this was exactly what he needed. The valiant man explained to the officials that everyone is destined to breathe their last, so it is better to die for a just cause, for protecting people is also part of the sacred duties of the control chamber. Today, by his action, he wanted to convey to this world that despite everything, there are still sane people in it. Moreover, if he had arrived here a little later, these officials would have destroyed all the trust of the townspeople with their own hands. Finally, he asked these scoundrels to remember the words he had spoken. The strong fight the strong, and the weak must fight the weak. The man did not even know what to say upon hearing such a bitter truth. He had no choice but to fall to his knees, for the current him was truly nothing more than a scoundrel. In the end, he ran after the lord, shouting at the top of his lungs that he was going with him, and even another official decided to follow the hero on the journey. The old man believed that these two had gone mad and longed for death, but even this did not scare them, and they firmly stood their ground, following the hero. Therefore, the man immediately grabbed his box, threw it over his shoulder, and followed his old friends. Nin kept repeating the names of these officials, Niu Jingxi, Wei Wentong, and Wu Sanxi. They seemed very familiar to him. Ordinary townspeople were quite surprised when they saw that an entire department had been mobilized. No one had ever seen them gather together before. People could not believe that the officials from the control chamber had actually resumed work. It seemed to them that this department did not even exist, as they had not heard this name for a very long time. Thus, under the astonished gazes of the crowd, our hero reached the very residence of the Marquis. Nin calmly looked at the girl accompanying him, and asked her to stay as far away from him as possible. Although she did not know about this, he was going to die a truly grand death. However, the little girl clearly remembered the hero's words that he might die in the coming days. She became very sad because Nin wanted to use his life to demonstrate to this world the true meaning of justice and equality. If someone had fought for her family when they faced that disaster, maybe everything would be completely different now. She could not allow Inina to die, even if for this she had to give her own life. At this moment, one of the eunuchs arrived at the imperial chambers to report to His Majesty that the control chamber, led by Lord Yi, is plotting something. Obviously, the emperor could not understand what exactly the matter was. However, suddenly, with the help of her magical artifact, she saw the entrance to the Marquis's residence. At that moment, Nin saw that even the door knockers of the residence were forged from pure gold. Apparently, the Marquis was not at all afraid that others might see how immensely wealthy he was. In the end, Kai Xianggao grabbed the hammer and immediately knocked loudly. As soon as the guard opened the door for him, the noble young man asked him to inform his master of their arrival. However, the young man's words sounded too uncertain, so our hero interrupted him. He reminded Kai Xianggao that they came here not at all to wish these little people a happy new year. He should not have relaxed in front of them, so Lord E immediately kicked the man off his feet, explaining that the control chamber had arrived here to arrest the offender and ordered to drive the outsiders away. The townspeople could not believe that the sacred chamber of control had arrived at the residence to make an arrest. Moreover, they dared to break down the gates of the Marquis himself. Everyone understood. Nina definitely would not survive after such an act. At that moment, the frightened guard ran to his superior, demanding that the guests not leave anywhere. However, at that very moment, the crossbowmen lying in wait immediately aimed their deadly arrows at them. Of course, Kai Shangao was quite shocked to see the combat weapon aimed at them. And the emperor was shocked by the betrayal of these people. He did not understand what the Marquis was trying to achieve with such behavior. However, to the great surprise of everyone present, while the crossbows were aimed at the heroes, the valiant E was not worried at all. His subordinates clearly saw how indifferent the strong leader was to his own life. They fully felt his indomitable fighting spirit in the air. Finally, they all realized, their leader is not afraid of death. However, at the moment when the crossbowmen were already ready to fire a volley, they heard the manager's order to stop. Approaching, he politely introduced himself and suggested that His Highness, who honored them with his visit, introduce himself first. Looking at the man, the hero understood that he was surely supported by some immortal sect, so he wished to learn as much as possible about it. The nobleman calmly introduced himself to the manager as the imperial censor of the control chamber, and said that today he had come specifically for the manager. Fortunately, he managed to expose their dark deeds, so he asked the manager to follow him. The manager had no idea which of his actions had been exposed. The man did not panic at all. He thought that such people from the control room did not threaten him. He just didn't understand why a long-closed agency would be concerned about his affairs early in the morning. However, Lord E calmly reminded that the control chamber is not closed at all. He stated that as long as the great celestial empire exists, the control chamber will not cease its sacred work, and future generations are forbidden to disband the control chamber. And immediately his words of wisdom spread again throughout the district. The townspeople remembered that the control chamber has always existed. It fights for their rights, and now it has finally returned in full force. Even the emperor was struck to the very heart by such speeches. However, the manager only mocked the minister, reminding him that the control chamber was completely useless. He thought that Nin decided to play cruel jokes on him and without any support from the immortal sects, which meant he could easily finish him off. Nin immediately realized that the man was apparently resisting arrest. However, the manager believed that the issue now was not at all whether he wanted to be arrested or not. The question now was whether he would want to release them from his house alive or dead. However, at this moment, the loyal Xuan stood before the hero, and the manager shouted loudly, demanding that his subordinates immediately kill her and the censor. Kai Shangao understood. The matter was taking a bad turn. These people do not take the control chamber seriously at all. At first, he thought they had managed to inspire this trio of officials and make their hearts tremble. However, now they were just waiting and trying to gather their strength. At the same time, the hero faced mortal danger, so he shielded Zhuan with his body. At this moment, the censor's friend loudly announced that the man they were trying to attack is one of the bearers of the sage's seal, who wrote a poem that shook the entire kingdom. The simple residents, having heard this, could not believe what they heard, so they immediately began to surround the Marquis's residence. They reminded that if the scoundrels want to kill the Lord, they will first have to get through all of them, for they will stand to the death to protect him. In the end, it took no more than a moment for our hero to be protected by many loyal townspeople. Kai Shangao tried to calm his brother, promising that he would not let him perish, and Ye Ning clearly did not expect such support from the people and was even angry. At this moment, the crossbowmen fired the first volley, aiming at the legs of the townspeople. In the end, they managed to retreat backward. These shots were of a warning nature. At that very moment, the Marquis himself appeared, who did not understand what people were doing in his residence. Moreover, he warned that those who dare to take one more step will be killed. Our hero, looking at this old man, perfectly understood that this man was the one he needed. The townspeople were not at all surprised that the Marquis, as usual, was authoritative and arrogant. That was how he always was. The noble E confessed to the townspeople that he values their good intention. However, today he came here on official duty to ensure the observance of heavenly laws. For this reason, he asked the townspeople to return to their homes and focus on studying, for the future of the Celestial Empire was in their hands. Of course, the townspeople were worried that these people would kill Nin. They could not just watch him being killed. However, our hero calmly reminded that there are people who can live forever, even after their death, and some continue to exist, despite having long been dead inside. However, after these words, the hero felt the energy in his body increase again, and his virtues grew even more. The hero was quite indignant. Although he was merely playing to the audience, however, Qi continued to consider him a virtuous man. At this moment, the officials who heard the respected gentleman. In fact, the Marquis's ancestors also relied on military merits to earn their title. Therefore, he truly held deep respect for true heroes and talents. Because in a world full of rotten corruption, Lord E was worthy of his sincere admiration. Moreover, the noble nobleman warned the hero that he was already on the list for elimination by the Ascension sect. If the honorable husband is destined to perish, it will definitely not be by his own hand. The Marquis was not going to sully himself with such dirt. After this, he turned his angry gaze to the manager, demanding that the scoundrel confess what he had done again and what made Mr. E bring such a number of people to arrest him. Immediately, the miserable servant fell to his knees, swearing before the Marquis that he knew nothing. The whole matter was that the scoundrel had committed so many crimes that he did not understand which one was being referred to. However, Kai Xiangao hoped that the manager would remember everything when he saw the old man they had brought with them. But the servant seemed genuinely unaware of who this man was. Kai Xiangao was deeply shocked. How dare he pretend even at such a moment? The manager once again fell prostrate before the Marquis, admitting that he did not know who this man was. And then the elder reminded that on that fateful day the servant stole his cart with coal. But the scoundrel still claimed to know nothing. In fact, the manager was stunned. Could this really be all the villainy he had committed? The scoundrel recalled that he had indeed taken the cart from that old man, but he could not believe that they came to the residence over such a trivial matter. Even the emperor himself was surprised that Lord E staged this entire grand spectacle over some coal. The residents of the capital were shocked that such a performance took place over such a petty reason. And the Marquis, looking angrily at the hero, warned that he should explain his actions. The Honorable Yi Ning did not understand why people perceived a cart of coal as some insignificant trifle. After that, he calmly explained to everyone who did not understand the essence of the matter. This elderly merchant cuts down trees on the southern hills, turning them into charcoal. Even the old man's face was the color of soot, and he himself was covered from head to toe in dust and dirt. Even his nails and fingers were blackened with soot. The lord from the Zhou Empire asked people to ponder. Where did the unfortunate man spend the money from selling coal, if not on clothing for the body or food to satisfy hunger? After all, his body was clothed in a miserable, tattered robe. The poor man worries about only one thing: earning a few pennies for hard work, praying to the gods in the icy cold at night outside the city. Snow up to the knees, and at dawn he sets off along the frozen rut with an exhausted ox and a hungry stomach in a lonely cart. Obviously, many were moved to tears by the hero's words. Those present had no idea that the poor had such a hard, joyless life, and realized that the thought hidden in the poem of the honorable man was not as simple as they initially assumed. But the Marquis believed that no matter how good the hero's poem was, it was all too meaningless. After all, the hard life of these poor people in no way concerned his residents. Then Lord E continued, telling about two riders who slowly rode past the unfortunate merchant. It was the Marquis himself and his footman in a white shirt. Waving documents in hand, they shouted of the honorable husband was much more terrifying than the fury of the immortal cultivators. Kai Xiangao then began to praise the beautiful poem of his sworn brother. He was proud that the hero today had started a new trend in poetry. Today, many have experienced the true hardship of the lives of the poor, and such a bunch of shameless rich people were unworthy even to be called human. However, the Marquis continued to blame the hero for everything, wondering if he was ready to trample on his family's reputation for the sake of some outcast. The Honorable E Nina was quite angered by such words. He was surprised at the Marquis. How dare he call a poor man an outcast? Such high-ranking and powerful nobles were like rootless duckweed. As is known, water can keep a boat afloat, but at the same time it can also sink it. Those who dare to look down on others will one day pay the price for it. Then, finally, the Marquis reminded them. He was not interested in engaging in a verbal quarrel with them. The titled person was going to let them go, but Lord E did not appreciate his magnanimous gesture. Therefore, the noble nobleman decided to take the hero's life instead of the Ascension sect. With these words, the Marquis ordered the crossbowmen to shoot arrows at the hero, but the honorable man was protected by a magical shield. In principle, the guy suspected that this virtuous power hidden within him would protect him. However, I still really hoped that this idiot Marquis had aces up his sleeve. Therefore, mocking, Lord E decided to test the power of the opponent. Was that all he was capable of? In the next moment, the Marquis ordered one of his subordinates to approach and smash the hero's face. However, at this critical moment, a court eunuch hastily arrived with the imperial decree in his hands. The Son of Heaven commanded, "This family feud must cease immediately. The palace will generously compensate for all the damage caused to the Marquis's residence." But the titled person boldly refused to obey the will of the emperor. The Honorable Yi Ning dared to deliberately humiliate the Marquis's residence and harm his spotless reputation, using his investigation only as a pathetic pretext. The noble nobleman could not leave this villainy unpunished. Until Lord E breathes his last, justice will not prevail. The hero also disobeyed the Emperor's command, for he did not wish to end these conflicts, hoping that he might finally find the desired death. The eunuch reminded the honorable gentleman that His Majesty issued this decree to put an end to the bloodshed. Therefore, he did not understand why the hero continued to stubbornly resist like a mountain goat. However, Lord E loudly proclaimed, reminding that the Marquis committed a grave crime. This situation will not end until the control chamber delivers the appropriate punishment to the scoundrel. After that, the honorable man addressed his subordinate to remind those present. What was the first law of the great Zhou Empire, established by the great founding ancestor? The loyal servant confidently proclaimed, "The control chamber has the right to deliver guilty verdicts. When the control chamber enforces the law, no one else has the right to obstruct this sacred process." The hero hoped that everyone clearly heard the words of his loyal subordinate. For this reason, Mr. E will not retreat until His Majesty enacts a new law completely abolishing the decrees of the great ancestor. Then Lord E loudly addressed the people. He understands that many consider him a person who makes a mountain out of a molehill. However, let everyone remember with what noble intentions the great ancestor created the control chamber. Governing a country, as known to the wise, means complete transparency and honesty. Therefore, no one has the right to judge crimes based on the nobility or wealth of the person who committed them. The law must be equal for everyone. From the poorest peasant to the most powerful prince. A just decree can save the state from ruin, while an unjust one can plunge it into chaos and turmoil. The townspeople understood. The Honorable E Nin was absolutely right. Human life must be valued equally, and a crime remains a crime, regardless of its scale. The one who committed the crime must face deserved punishment. Therefore, they all began to support the just Lord even more fervently. Lord E himself calmly shared his cherished dream. He hoped that the youth of the great empire could live a bright, worthy life. The light of one person's life may be a faint flame, but the light from 1,000,000 souls can illuminate the entire vast country. The emperor, hearing this in his room, wept, listening to these words. He did not believe that the young man was ready to sacrifice his life to awaken the great Zhou Empire from its centuries-old slumber. For this reason, he loudly called upon anyone with influence in the capital to use all available means to save the hero's life, at any cost. The news of the deeds of the honorable man quickly reached the house of Spring Breeze. The faithful maid noticed how Mistress Xiaoqian suddenly began to prepare for the journey. However, the beauty explained nothing, only scolded the self-loving idiot who considers himself the only light of the great empire. She wanted to beat him well for such foolishness until he finally opened his blind eyes wider. At the same moment, sad news also reached the Lo family. There, the young Lo Sanyuan begged his respected father to let him hurry to help Mr. E. However, the elder believed that it was already too late to help the hero. Moreover, his son was not an immortal cultivator. Even if he went there, he would be of little use. Lo Sanyuan understood everything perfectly, and knew that he would not be able to provide worthy help. But he could not just sit idly and do nothing, because then he would not be able to respect himself afterward. Therefore, the young man begged his father to let him go, for he did not want to regret his cowardice for his entire life. In the end, the old man had no choice but to wave his hand to the servants, signaling them to step back, and the son immediately broke free, rushing headlong toward the exit. Watching him leave, the father admitted to himself, he also hopes to save A Nin. But now for the great Zhou Empire, he must complete one extremely important task. At this moment, the Marquis was indignant at the bunch of miserable parasites. However, he reminded Lord E, what use is it that many commoners are on his side? Behind the titled person stood the entire powerful Jade Chamber. Therefore, in this world, no one would dare to touch him. Today, the noble nobleman decided, so be it, to allow the Honorable E Ninu to expand his meager horizons, and will show him the true treasure of the immortal sect. After that, the Marquis loudly ordered his servants to immediately approach and finish off the scoundrel. At once, sinister iron undead, summoned by the secret technique of the Jade Chamber, jumped down to the ground. As soon as people saw them, they immediately began to beg Lord E to flee for safety, for he would not be able to defend himself against the steel undead. And Lord E was quite glad that he would finally find death, hoping that this time no one would be able to save him from the desired fate. However, the hero's loyal subordinate stood up in his defense, indignantly asking, what audacious scoundrels dared to prevent the control chamber from administering justice? He crushed the first Iron Dead Man with a powerful fist, reminding, in the old days, he alone commanded thousands of warriors. Then he broke through the hordes of wild barbarians of the Golden Horde, having behind him only 5,000 armored cavalry. In those days, he thought that victory in the war would be only the beginning of my glorious life. He managed to defeat the barbarians, and as a reward, he was honored with the position of magistrate of the Chamber of Control. and that was my end. The former great warrior, as he was, is dead. But from this day on, only the representative of the control chamber remains alive. Magistrate Niu Jingxi! Mr. E watched what was happening, his mouth agape with amazement. He could not believe that this sullen fat man practiced martial arts. The titled person had no idea that he would be the one to deliver the unexpected blow from behind. The Honorable E. Nina was at least pleased that behind him there were still 3 iron dead men left, and the hero hoped that no more unpleasant surprises would arise. In the end, all the undead rushed at him in a furious attack. However, suddenly Lord E heard the cries of a subordinate who was calling the enemies to him. After all, Niu Jinshi was not the only valiant magistrate. Official Wei was also among them. As known to the wise, the great ancestor of the Zhou Empire created his own martial doctrine with unparalleled combat skills. Wei Wentong practiced this martial art description, and by the age of 15 had surpassed all martial arts masters in the capital. At 18, he dedicated himself to serving the imperial palace of the great Zhou Empire and took the post of constable. In just 4 years, he solved countless unsolved and major cases. After that, he was called Divine Constable No. 1. So now, shielding the hero with himself, he calmly explained to the young man, "When the heart dies, the Divine Constable No. 1 also ceases to exist. But when a person regains determination, no one dares to stand in their way." With these words, he rushed at the other dead men, cutting down all 3 with his shining blade in a single burst. The Marquis opened his mouth wide in astonishment, unable to believe what he saw. After that, he shouted loudly, calling Lord E a shameless scoundrel who dared to destroy his priceless treasures, pretending to be a wolf in sheep's clothing. However, the Honorable E Nin asked the Marquis to stop underestimating his worthy opponents. He must use everything he has, otherwise next time a similar opportunity will not arise. In the end, intending to finish off this daring boy, the Marquis drew a sharp blade, piercing his own palm with it. Scarlet drops of blood dripping from his hand fell to the ground and gathered around the man, creating a certain ominous silhouette. Soon behind the titled person, a huge beast materialized, resembling a demonic wolf with terrifying horns. This monster immediately shielded the Marquis with itself, and it looked, to put it mildly, extremely threatening. Lord E hoped that this time he would definitely manage to find the desired death if this beast attacks him. Both Niu Jingxi and Wei Wentong had no idea how the Marquis dared to raise such a demonic creature. The noble aristocrat himself rejoiced in anticipation, eager to see how these miserable officials would manage his formidable weapon. This time he also promised his bloodthirsty little beast, if it could defeat the opponents, the noble lord would double its number of victims for a whole year. At such a generous offer, the demonic creature growled contentedly, anticipating a bloody feast. At this moment, the last remaining official realized he would still have to intervene in the fight. Cold-bloodedly approaching his master, he placed a massive black suitcase next to himself. Immediately it blossomed like a lotus flower, and a dazzling golden light began to stream from it, similar to the rays of the rising sun. When the mysterious casket fully opened, a majestic golden weapon emerged from it, joyfully greeting its old friend. The legendary swordsman understood. The time had come for the blade to emerge and breathe in the fresh air of battle. The Honorable Yi Ning could not believe that this humble man had obtained a real flying sword. The hero had no idea why the simple officials gathered here turned out to be such powerful warriors. Even the beautiful Zhuan was so shocked that she forgot to remain silent, not understanding. Who is this mysterious old man before her? At this moment, even the fierce wolf, seeing the flying blade wrapped in divine golden radiance, froze in place like a statue, clearly doubting the wisdom of the attack. After that, the demonic creature panicked and rushed away while explosions of pure energy oozed from the sacred blade behind its back. In the end, when the celestial weapon struck the wolf, he was crushed by just one devastating blow. At the point of impact, a grand explosion occurred, causing all the observers to reverently open their mouths in astonishment. The Marquis, who was near the epicenter of the destruction, was deeply shocked and did not even know what to do in such a critical situation. At this moment, the master of the flying blade calmly declared, "Anyone who dares to interfere with the control chamber in administering justice must be punished by death." It was then that the simple peasants realized. They had never suspected that the control chamber possessed such terrifying power. If Lord E has such divine helpers on his side, in the future he will no longer have to restrain himself. At that moment, Madame Xiao Qian was nearby, observing everything that was happening. She perfectly understood. The Honorable Yi Nin obviously did not know the true power of his followers. After all, even the beauty herself and His Majesty knew nothing about the true nature of these people. Perhaps all these loyal comrades of the hero were a blessing granted by the heavens themselves. At this moment, all 3 knelt before their boss, congratulating him on a brilliant victory. Lord E could not believe that his allies turned out to be true hidden masters. Never before had the hero seen a man controlling a flying blade with such skill. Therefore, he loudly exclaimed, demanding worthy explanations from this trio for their supernatural abilities. Originally, the Honorable Yi Ning hoped that he finally had a great chance to become a deceased person. However, the heavens seemed to curse him. For all this time, he simply longed to find death, but could not. The hero did not even understand why in his case this was so difficult, when for everyone else it seemed the simplest thing. Loyal officials stood before the Lord as a protective wall, making it clear. Anyone who wishes to harm him must first crush them all. At that moment, the loyal Kai Xianggao ran up to Lord Yi, who finally recalled that these three masters had a very impressive past. It turned out that Wei Wentong was the legendary divine constable. Niu Jingxi was a renowned general of the Border Legion, and Wu Sanxi mastered the art of the flying sword. The elder intervened only because he wanted to protect the master and make sure that nothing bad would happen to him. Wei Wentong and Niu Jingxi solemnly swore that from this day forward they would follow the hero, regardless of any obstacles, in order to restore the former glory of the control chamber. Of course, the Honorable Yi Nin tried to explain to them that they were not obliged to do this. He did not need anyone following him closely. And finally, Kai Xianggao realized Lord Ye's train of thought. He was literally a lone wolf. The hero always tried to rely only on his own strength, so as not to drag others into danger. However, these words delighted the devoted followers even more. After all, thanks to the hero, they became more enlightened, and therefore, will become the strongest allies for their lord in the future. At that moment, Lord Yi sighed disappointedly, and Kai Xianggao obviously thought that the named brother was so happy that he simply had no words to express his joy. At that moment, the completely disappointed hero suggested to his companions to stop the empty talk, and looking at the Marquis, calmly reminded that they still had unfinished business. But the Marquis only shouted about what Lord Yi had done to his residence. However, the hero made it clear. Initially, the situation escalated solely due to the Marquis himself, who boldly resisted arrest. And this was only the beginning, if he does not stop immediately. The enraged Marquis immediately rushed forward, approaching the hero to tear him apart with his bare hands. However, his path was instantly blocked by Wei Wentong and Niu Jingxi, forcing the enraged aristocrat to retreat. Therefore, stepping back to his subordinates, the titled person threatened. Although the situation has changed a little, he will definitely take revenge on the Honorable Yi Ninu when the right time comes. At that moment, both warriors breathed a sigh of relief, not believing that the Marquis was actually such a miserable scoundrel. Lord Yi thanked these two for the invaluable help they gave him on this day. Soon rumors that the control chamber had resumed functioning spread among the people like a wildfire. It was hard to believe. As soon as it resumed work, it immediately clashed with the Marquis himself. People rejoiced that the great Zhou Empire finally had a place defending the rights of the peaceful population. An immortal sect stood behind these people, considering that the hero secretly hoped that the Marquis would request reinforcements to quickly take his life. However, the elder was warning not about the immortal sect at all. According to rumors, in recent years the titled individual has managed to build an extensive network of influence and apparently was somehow connected to the House of Misty Rain. About this, Sansa spoke with a special, sinister seriousness. However, the hero seemed not to know this name, which intrigued him greatly. The wise elder explained that the House of Misty Rain is a notorious assassin organization. No one knows who their mysterious leader is, but if a person pays the right price, they will crush even immortal cultivators. After that, Wu Sanxi handed the Honorable Yi Nin a small protective seal, which he must always carry with him to guard against assassins sent by the House of Misty Rain. However, Lord Yi firmly refused this talisman, for he was already protected by the father's virtue, so additional amulets were unnecessary for him. Of course, the whole point was that the hero would be only glad if these people came to kill him. However, Sansa continued to insist. For as the wise know, it is easy to dodge a spear thrown in an open area, but it is much harder to avoid a sudden strike of a blade from the shadows. Therefore, the elder wished for the hero to carry this talisman with him. As is known, in their world there are many ways to harm someone. The gentleman has no desire to harm others, but he must always remain vigilant. In the end, unable to resist curiosity, the Honorable Yi Ning decided to ask after all, who exactly is this mysterious old man Wu Sanxi? However, he only smiled mysteriously in response to this question, never giving the hero the desired answer. In the end, as soon as Wu Sanxi left, Lord Yi realized that he still knew too little about this mysterious world. As is known, the great ancestor of the Zhou Empire was a great genius sent by the heavens themselves. He initiated the unparalleled prosperity of the great empire, which lasted for 3,000 years. But to great regret, after this he vanished without a trace, and his fate remains an unsolved mystery to this day. In this world, immortal cultivators can easily live for several millennia, but after the disappearance of the great ancestor, none of the emperors of subsequent generations could live more than 150 years. This was truly strange, no matter how you look at it. Why was the length of their lives so strikingly different? The hero felt that someone had definitely had a hand in it, some sinister force operating from the shadows. Ultimately, a series of premature imperial deaths caused a sharp decline in the fate of the great Zhou Empire. But it was at that critical moment that the last pillar of the great power appeared. He believed that such a powerful person as the great ancestor could not simply vanish into oblivion. The only thing they could do to save the country was to find the great ancestor and restore the fate of the great Zhou Empire. The senior officer helped the great ancestor cultivate the land, and therefore he simply could not believe that the manager blamed herself for not having studied the control chamber more carefully earlier. Perhaps then all these talents would not have felt so abandoned throughout all this time. However, the emperor could not place all the blame on the beautiful Xiao Qian, for being the son of heaven, even he failed to realize that so many talented people had been forgotten. Then Madame Xiao Qian suggested looking at the situation from another perspective. After all, His Majesty's decision to send the Honorable Ye Ning to the control chamber proved truly wise. The emperor also hoped that the decision was made correctly. But it was still strange. Sansa had an expert capable of controlling a flying sword, yet there was so little information about him. Even for Miss Xiao Qian, this was surprising. It felt as if this person appeared out of nowhere. He had neither family nor past. Even the skilled beauty could find nothing except his name. In this world, there are only two places inviolable to the secret spy department: the Immortal Sect and the Imperial Palace. They understood. It was necessary to find out who Wu Sanxi was. Otherwise, if he remained close to Lord Yi, this could become too dangerous. By evening, the events moved to the control chamber, where the joyful Kai Xianggao rushes in with good news. Wei Wentong and Niu Jingxi were finally able to make a breakthrough. It turned out that thanks to the support of the gentleman, the first was able to comprehend many truths, and make the leap from the level of an ordinary master to great master. Kai Xianggao could not help but be proud of the great masters, for now Wei Wentong could even compete with true experts, and Lord Yi realized he would have to keep much farther away from the guy. When he stepped back, he unexpectedly bumped into the powerful chest of Niu Jingxi, who was standing behind. The valiant general also wished to boast before the gentleman that he had managed to make a breakthrough. He even teared up while telling how his clan always used various battles to awaken the power of their bloodline. However, the current power of the blood heritage was not even 1/10 of what it used to be in the old days. Of course, the Honorable Yi Nin tried to comfort her husband, explaining that as long as he continues to work hard, everything will be fine. However, Niu Jingxi explained to the hero that thanks to his words and guidance, the spirit of competition flared up in him again, and the true power of the bloodline, which had been dormant in his body until now, was awakened. And Lord Yi only bitterly laughed, realizing that all the comrades seemed to have joyful news. After that, he decided to hastily return to his solitary reading. In fact, the hero did not understand what was happening. He was already in a difficult situation, and now these guys decided to give him new problems. At this moment, Wei Wentong was confident. Since they had all become stronger, they could be assured that Lord Ye's life was not in danger, considering that the Marquis was a vengeful person who would definitely try to harm the Lord. Therefore, Wei Wentong swore that from this day forward he would never leave his master. Following the comrade, the other two fighters took similar oaths. Soon the hero headed home, passing through the market together with little Zhuan. However, from time to time, the body of the Honorable Yi Nin would turn around, looking around. Zhuan seemed to think that the gentleman was worried about possible pursuers. However, even though she could not say anything, she understood. He should not worry because she, if anything, would not allow anything to happen to him. At this moment, the hero was truly glad that he had accepted the seal talisman from the Elder Yu. This temporarily convinced his comrades to stop chasing him relentlessly. Moreover, he honestly admitted to himself, these diligent guards had already quite tired him out. Lord Yi headed to the house of the immortal drunkards, as his priority now was to find a place where the killers could easily find him. After all, the hero did not want to make the virtues do extra work. He sincerely hoped that the killers would find this place, for their desired target was right here. However, as soon as the hero stepped over the threshold of the establishment, all the eyes of those present immediately turned to him as if to the rising sun. Visitors immediately surrounded the gentleman, eager to at least shake his hand or get a precious autograph from him. Of course, the Honorable Yi Nin asked the visitors to stop pushing and also to make room for those in need. However, they all really wanted to admire the famous gentleman, so people began pushing each other, trying to get closer to him. Xuan and Lord Yi felt extremely cramped. It seemed that even if killers were hiding here, they would not be able to get to the hero through this living wall. However, this could not continue any longer, as the Honorable Yi Ninu needed to publicly ridicule the Marquis. At that moment, one of the visitors decided to ask the gentleman about his further plans regarding the matter with the titled lady. However, the hero immediately, standing on the table, loudly declared that the matter was not at all about their personal confrontation. From now on, the control chamber will fight any evil to the very end. Therefore, Lord E threatened the Marquis to all present. He should prepare himself, for what happened today was only the beginning. Everyone immediately clapped their hands, praising the noble gentleman, and rejoicing that they would no longer live under the same sky with such a villain. Soon such bold words reached the Marquis himself, who in a furious rage began throwing expensive things against the walls. The titled person swore that they also would not live under the same roof with the Honorable E. Nino. After that, he turned to the servant standing behind him. The man who appeared immediately respectfully asked how he could assist his master. However, the Marquis, grabbing the servant by the collar, angrily ordered him to go on the mission and find that very man. He must tell him that the titled person needs Lord E's head, no matter the cost. The scoundrel must get it today. In the end, the envoy set off by order to the old house on the outskirts of the city. Bowing in a bow, he introduced himself, explaining that he had arrived from the Marquis's residence and wished to meet with Mr. Mu. However, the person who was in the house was very displeased upon seeing the uninvited guest. In the end, the servant had to justify that he came here by the order of his master and could not disobey. And finally, the man allowed him to enter inside to discuss the essence of the task. A man cloaked in a cloak, with a demonic smile, inquired, "Who does he need to eliminate this time?" Then the envoy, bowing, calmly explained that the target was the Imperial censor from the control chamber named Yi Ning. However, the killer had already heard about this person and warned that the client would have to pay generously if they want to obtain this target. Meanwhile, the hero was in his residence looking around here and there. Even his loyal servant was surprised that the master seemed extremely worried after returning home and did not understand what he was trying to find in the yard. Lord E just went her. At this time, Lord E's preparations were complete, so he hoped that the Marquis would hurry with his business and finally kill him. Deep night had come. The hero lay calmly on his bed, absolutely worrying about nothing. At that moment, little Juan approached him. She brought incense with her that soothed the soul and was capable of putting a person into a deep sleep for 6 hours. After that, the girl calmly braided her hair into a high ponytail and thanked the Honorable Inin for everything. He had always been the one who protected them. Finally embracing her true form, she realized it was her turn to protect him. Juan hoped that the hero would get a good night's sleep, and when he woke up, a new day would come for him. She also placed the amulet in his clothes. Xuan hoped that the hero's hands would remain clean, so that he could compose the most beautiful poem in the whole world. She was going to deal with all the dirty work instead of him. At that moment, the girl noticed someone beginning to approach the gates leading to the young master's residence. It was a man, hidden by a cloak and armed with a blade. Obviously, Xuan could not believe it. Someone decided to use paper puppets to check the situation. That means the mercenaries were extremely cautious. When this doll lunged at her, the girl shattered it into tiny pieces. However, instead of parts of the human body, only scraps of paper began to swirl in the air. But soon on the roof she noticed another ominous silhouette. Such puppets gathered around the residence of the young gentleman. At that moment, Xuan noticed, on their weapons, which they held in their hands, a deadly poison had been applied. Therefore, she had no choice but to use the rain cloud sword formation. When all the puppets attacked her, the girl swept them away with a hurricane of icy water. This technique involved condensing moisture, after which an explosion occurred, scattering ice shards around the area. In the end, all the paper dolls crumbled into tiny particles. The mercenary watching the young lady realized, considering her tender age, she possessed a truly remarkable talent. Therefore, he even offered her to join the House of Misty Rain. However, Juan believed that some so-called House of Misty Rain did not deserve talents like hers at all. With these words, she dealt a crushing blow to the man standing ahead. However, this disgusting mercenary turned out to be just another decoy, a paper man. When the girl destroyed him, the dark mist headed to the window of the room where the hero was resting. The true killer only laughed at the young lady, making it clear she was never his real target. After this, the entire mist began to gather into a human silhouette. He looked at the hero as if at an idiot who, even in the face of death itself, remained in blissful ignorance. After that, the killer raised his blade to deliver a fatal blow to the enemy's body. However, as soon as he struck, the amulet immediately protected its master's body. Juan knew what would happen next and understood. It was this mercenary who was the real idiot. Soon there was a grand explosion that sent the killer flying out of the house. Only then did he realize Juan was a real scoundrel who dared to set an ambush and destroy his internal energy shell using a talisman. The girl could not believe that such a mercenary had the audacity to even call her a wretch. But even after losing his shell, the killer could not stop until he finished off this impudent fellow. At that moment, Juan noticed. The man activated a small teleportation talisman, then disappeared. The girl understood. Since this man possessed the inner shell and the small talisman, this killer must have been a very important figure in the organization. At that moment, the mercenary was standing apart and was extremely enraged, realizing that all his puppets had been destroyed. Therefore, he immediately ordered his subordinates to listen to his command. All killers of the Misty Rain House of Iron Plate level and below, no matter what it takes, must appear for the mission to eliminate the Honorable Yi Nin. And Zhuan stood in the middle of the yard, watching as a multitude of sinister mercenaries approached her through the night darkness. However, the girl made it clear to all the mercenaries, no one is allowed to harm her dear master. After that, a fierce battle broke out, which lasted until sunrise. Finally, everything was over, and the exhausted Zhuan realized she had managed to protect her benefactor. Madame Xiaoqian was watching the entire scene through the magic mirror. She could admit, the girl fought quite skillfully. Unlike her late father, her willpower proved to be much superior. After that, their scientific goal had been completely destroyed, and all years of study were lost in an instant. Therefore, they loudly shouted, accusing the valiant zealot of excessive cruelty. Even his friend was, to put it mildly, shocked. Because for a person, a broken scholarly goal is the same as breaking a cultivator's dantian. If this happens, most likely the person will never be able to enter the scholarly sect again. The founder calmly explained through our hero that this was only a test of their inner essence, imposed on them by the sword of the ancestor. These corrupt little people deserve to have their scholarly energy broken forever. At that moment, the Son of Heaven proudly looked at our hero, for he could not believe that a lord from the Zhou Empire would help him achieve something the ruler had dreamed of his entire life, but had never been able to accomplish. After that, the emperor carefully looked over his assistant Liao Sheng, lying together with all the officials. The cunning official was like a true seasoned actor, pretending that he too was wounded by the founder's energy. At that moment, the founder contacted the brave fighter for the last time, explaining that he had very little time left, and from that moment on, he fully entrusted the control chamber to our hero. And obviously Lord Yi wished for the founder to leave his body as soon as possible, for the nobleman was too embarrassed. At that moment, the officials once again began accusing the daring brave man of having planned it all from the very beginning. His friends picked up on it, thinking that the gentleman's plan was simply brilliant. He managed to deceive even them. However, the fearless fighter did not understand at all where his comrades got some kind of deception from. At that moment, the imperial censor fell to his knees, realizing that he deserved such punishment. When he was young, the gray-bearded official planned to use everything he was taught to help the homeland, but his career helped him achieve success, and he let it down. Now the old dignitary was ashamed to appear before his ancestors. Therefore, with tears, he ran away from the imperial palace. While the censor, crying, was running away, he accidentally bumped into a eunuch standing nearby. Obviously, he had no idea what had happened in the palace at all, since the overseer himself ran out of there in tears. At that moment, the other officials also ran out, realizing that they were unworthy of their positions, for they had betrayed the noble traditions passed down through the years. They all ran past the eunuch, who stood frozen in shock, not knowing how to process what he had seen. At that moment, the emperor looked at the official before him in puzzlement. The master wished to know, was everything that happened just now planned from the very beginning? Soon the Son of Heaven met with his close associates, who understood that the brave zealot had truly managed to grant the emperor a huge gift. However, the ruler had no idea what the valiant fighter intended to do with the consequences of his actions. Sima Qian concluded. This time, the gentleman from the Zhou Empire and the control chamber really managed to remind the whole world of their existence. They dared to challenge the immortal sect. It will be quite difficult to guard the audacious bold one with the help of the espionage department. However, Liao Shen noticed that the situation was far from being so bad. They always thought about how to hide the light of Lord Yi under some kind of veil, but never thought that they would fail to conceal the radiance emanating from his body. A noble man was born in this turbulent time. He is destined to become a person radiating the brightest light. Such people have two paths. The first is to put an end to the chaos in this world and become a sage, and the second is to perish in pursuit of their dream and achieve eternal glory. In the end, the gray-bearded advisor admitted that he had already reflected on many things, so he made the decision that the path they had been following all this time might have been wrong. And a fearless fighter is a person sent by him from above to correct all shortcomings. They were always under enormous pressure, and at the same time ignored the roles of inept rulers among these officials to accumulate even more power, while not revealing the slightest details. However, if everything continues like this, they will have serious problems. The wise advisor told how he once planted a special fruit tree in his old house. He was told that this tree needs to accumulate nutrients for 3 years to bear its first fruits. To produce the most delicious fruits, this tree stops growing for a whole 3 years. 3 years later, Liao Shen returned to look at this fruit tree, but learned that the people living in his old house had cut it down. And on the other hand, a tree that cannot bear fruit is a dead tree in the eyes of other people. The great Zhou was like a dead tree, and the brave zealot is the only remaining green leaf on this dead tree. Finally, the emperor understood that he needed to send messages to everyone about what happened today. The Lord wished for all who walk under the same sky with them to know about what occurred. After all, a man named Yi Nin continues his service at the imperial court. They still had a government institution called the Chamber of Control, continuing its work in the capital. The next day, all these citizens heard the news that the valiant man was appointed chief officer. And he also built a trap and drove all the scoundrels out of the court in one fell swoop. Therefore, everyone was even more amazed by the respected gentleman. Everyone praised the daring brave man at the gates of his residence. However, our hero understood. People clearly overestimated him, for he was not as good as they thought. However, the noble man realized that he was originally destined to be a mere passerby. He was not worthy of such treatment. However, suddenly Lord Yi felt that something was flying straight at his head. It was a bottle of alcohol thrown by Sangxi, who noticed that the gentleman has been sighing very heavily lately. In the end, the fearless fighter drank the offered beverage and sighed heavily. The valiant zealot admitted that he fears not living up to the hopes of the people who believed in him. However, the devoted servant laughed at the words of the Lord. The gray-bearded guard did not understand how a person like the brave fighter could even have such thoughts. Then our hero admitted that he used to urge a famous horse with a whip, fearing that it would not be able to maintain its former level of beauty. Perhaps the nobleman is not who these people thought he was, and the more hopes they placed on him, the more disappointed they will be in him. However, the loyal servant reminded that it was only thanks to the master from the Zhou Empire that they stopped being walking dead. This is one of the reasons why the devoted guardian asked the soul mirror to subject the daring brave man to a trial. The gray-bearded man is sure that in this generation only one person deserves the position of chief officer, and in his opinion that person should be Lord Yi. Obviously, the brave fighter was surprised by the subordinate's words, and only modestly explained that he was not as good as he thought. Only later did the noble man realize that everything that happened to him was the fault of Wu Sanxi. The fearless zealot became very angry when he found out that it was the faithful servant who summoned this mirror. However, the devoted guard calmly explained that he had merely awakened the mirror from its sleep. What happened next was merely the result of the fact that the gentleman earned the approval of the Mirror of Souls through his behavior. All of this happened thanks to him alone. However, Lord Yi could not believe that he had brought trouble upon himself again. Before that, the daring brave man was still wondering why the mirror appeared as if out of nowhere, and he suddenly became the chief officer. The courageous fighter was very disappointed in Wu Sanxi. He seemed so honest, but at the last moment decided to betray him. In the end, our hero remembered. He had people protecting him of the first class. There were also second-class defenders like Niu Jingxi, Wei Wentong, and Kai Xianggao. There was also a special protector, a certain mysterious stranger who helped him fend off the killers. So the nobleman had to be ready for his appearance. At that moment, the hero's first disciple ran into the residence, explaining that the Hall of Justice of the Control Chamber had finally opened. However, the brave zealot had never heard before that such a hall existed. It turned out that the courtroom only opens when a new chief officer appears. The guards thought that the gentleman was surely interested in the true key secret of the control chamber. In the end, with an ominous creak, the two gates swung open, and Lord Yi entered the very control chamber. After that, Wu Sanxi led the noble husband to his throne, asking the ruler to sit down. And for some reason, the fearless fighter had the feeling that this gray-bearded old man knew everything about this sacred place. Soon our hero sat down where the devoted servant asked him to sit. And suddenly golden rays appeared from the painting, enveloping his entire body. The valiant zealot immediately realized that information left by previous chief officers for future successors was inscribed on these golden rays. The chief officers of Great Zhou were entrusted with enormous responsibility, comparable only to that of emperors. In addition to obeying laws, maintaining discipline in the imperial court, and making lawful decisions, the daring bold man also commanded the capital army. In summary, the Hall of Justice was the core of the capital army. And the brave fighter clearly understood. If he unleashed this power right now, the capital would be instantly destroyed. So the noble man will finally be able to die. However, immediately dismissing these thoughts, the fearless zealot slapped himself, realizing that he could not drag other people along just because of his own thirst for death. At that moment, Wu Sanxi decided to ask the gentleman if he had received the message left by the first chief officer. Lord Yi proudly declared that he understood everything said, and moreover noted that the gray-bearded elder was well acquainted with this place. However, the valiant man did not see a single document that would indicate a connection between the devoted servant and the Wu Zhan, and he was originally from the imperial palace. The brave zealot immediately began going through all the people he knew with the surname Yu who could have been from the palace. And suddenly the nobleman realized that not long ago he had read information about this person. In February of the 37th year of the 60-year cycle, the sect's 60-year-old raised a rebellion, and chaos reigned around. They attracted the attention of monsters outside the capital and led them inside. The great ancestor was furious. He sent there a guard holding the flag of the heavenly victorious army. Wherever this banner appeared, the enemies were crushed to dust. At that time, the name Heavenly Victorious Army, which defeated enemies with the help of a single guardian, was synonymous with death itself. The gray-bearded elder calmly explained that the great ancestor bestowed the surname upon every member of this army. He did this so that they could forever preserve their fighting spirit in their minds. The devoted servant also wished to follow in the footsteps of the great ancestor in terms of battles and expeditions, but unfortunately was born too late. The Heavenly Victorious Army disappeared long ago. Now it has turned into the Imperial Army guarding the inner courtyard of the Imperial Palace. Sanxi regretfully explained that he used to be the commander of the Imperial Army serving the previous emperor. One day, as usual, he was patrolling the palace grounds and suddenly heard someone calling for help. The gray-bearded guard ran towards the sound and found a disciple of the divine sect. He was teasing some woman because she refused to obey him. Then the scoundrel simply went mad and took her life right on the spot. That day, Great Zhou rewarded various immortal sects according to their merits. Members of the divine sect believed they had support. No one in Great Zhou dared to touch them, even considering the murder of a woman. But not the gray-bearded warrior. As the leader of the Imperial Army, he did what he had to do. Members of the divine sect raised a rebellion, which made the emperor furious. The Lord destroyed the martial arts cultivation of the loyal servant and expelled him from the Imperial Army. And the Son of Heaven decreed that he should never again cross the threshold of the Imperial Palace for the rest of his days. For this reason, the gray-bearded guard was transferred to the control chamber. He had less and less time left, so he began to cultivate swordsmanship techniques. He managed to reach some heights. Of course, Lord Yi found it hard to believe that Wu Sanxi's martial arts cultivation had been destroyed, so he switched to studying swordsmanship techniques. The devoted servant managed to become a true strong swordsman in less than 60 years. This man was a true genius of sword technique, undoubtedly. Looking at the person before him, the brave zealot promised that one day he would help him take revenge for all the humiliations he had endured. No one will dare to intimidate the control chamber anymore. Somewhere around the same time, the mercenary was beating his servant, who had acted recklessly, and now wanted the master to clean up the mess they had left. As mentioned earlier, the master sent the army to the capital for further investigation. Now the capital was under the command of the House of Spring Breeze. They could not take hasty actions, and yet his subordinate dared to personally accept the Marquis's order. Moreover, after his failure, he dared to gather even more assassins, causing the House of Misty Rain to lose half of its people. Immediately, bowing his head to the ground, the mercenary realized his mistake and began to swear that it would not happen again. His master himself realized that this time he had messed up because he underestimated the girl who was constantly hanging around the fearless fighter. Thanks to Lord Yi, the entire Great Zhou was literally boiling. However, the Dark Lord lost too many people, which means he had to repay this debt. Somewhere at the same moment, a peasant met the old man whom the Marquis's managers were mocking. The commoner was insanely grateful to the gentleman who did his job simply excellently. Moreover, since the valiant zealot achieved justice for him, the gray-bearded man wished to repay the benefactor. And he and his wife prepared some local goods for the brave fighter. The peasant very much hoped that the young man would accept such a modest gift from him. However, as soon as the cloth was removed from the cart, Lord Yi thought that the man had made some mistake. Indeed, seeing a woman lying among the vegetables, the noble husband got the impression that their house truly had very special local goods. At that moment, the peasants were discussing how lucky their country was to simultaneously get rid of such a large number of corrupt officials at the imperial court. On the street, they even noticed the wandering Minister of Finance. It is remembered that he used to be a bold, confident, and useless official riding around the district in a palanquin. Now he was just pathetic trash. Moreover, the common people heard that Mr. Yi did not stop at cleaning out corrupt officials. Conscientious officials who were oppressed and removed from their positions for strictly following the letter of the law have resumed their duties. And also people with great potential, who were imprisoned for daring to insult those corrupt scoundrels, were released. People who adhered to the right ideals but did not know how to apply them finally got the opportunity to realize their aspirations and show what they are capable of. All this became possible only thanks to the new leader of Confucianism, Mr. Yi. At that moment, the gray-bearded peasant began rummaging through his cart, while our hero could not find the words to describe the goods of the honorable man. It turns out the elder's speech was about a small bundle of healing herbs personally gathered by him for the gentleman. After that, the commoner awkwardly explained that the girl in the carriage was picked up by him yesterday in the mountains. He and his wife were very worried because the beauty would not wake up, so the peasant decided to bring her to the city to ask for help. Looking at the stranger, Lord Yi saw that her attire looked quite unusual. At that moment, Wei Wentong approached closer. He checked the body of the woman who continued to absorb spiritual qi from the air. There was a possibility that she was a cultivator. Unfortunately, she had nothing on her that could help identify her identity. Our hero was even amazed by the boy's diligence. After that, he suggested finding the lamp that absorbs souls, which the young man had just mentioned. Of course, the boy tried to warn the gentleman that this lamp was too dangerous. He himself could have taken it. However, Lord Yi believed that the young man was too young to take the risk. He himself could take it. However, they had not yet reached the room when the fragments of the lamp fell at the feet of the brave zealot. The awakened demonic cultivator quickly realized that this was exactly the thing the noble gentleman had been trying to find all this time. Soon the faithful messenger appeared to the ruthless mercenaries from the House of Misty Rain to deliver the will of his mighty lord. The Marquis was in a fierce determination. He and the noble Lord Yi were like two enraged tigers, each ready to fight to the last breath. Moreover, the powerful Marquis made a fateful decision to increase the previous reward tenfold. The experienced mercenary almost dropped his jaw at such a generous bonus, and immediately turning to his leader, he froze with a silent question in his eyes. The messenger himself stared with undisguised amazement at the formidable leader of the House of Misty Rain. At that moment, the cunning leader did not hesitate long. He knew perfectly well that the mighty Marquis was capable of fulfilling his promises, for behind him stood the all-powerful Jade Chamber. Therefore, he loudly declared that the House of Misty Rain would take on the appointed task. Initially, he had already planned to take the life of the daring Yi Nin, but he did not expect that the Marquis would dare to offer him such an outrageous sum. Moreover, there had been no news from the mysterious mentor for several days. They searched for her diligently, but in vain, as if she had vanished into thin air. Perhaps a beautiful lady got into some unfortunate trouble, or maybe she never even set off for the brilliant capital. However, everyone knew perfectly well that the actions of women always remained a mystery to male minds. Even trying to understand their intentions was a fruitless endeavor. Therefore, the cold-blooded leader proposed to end this task once and for all. They were to use the head of the daring Yi Nin as a welcoming gift for their esteemed mentor. At that very moment, our valiant hero looked at Pei Yuhan with bewilderment, wanting to find out why the beauty had suddenly awakened from a deep oblivion. This seemed truly strange. The elegant woman even suggested that perhaps the noble Yi Nin did not want her awakening at all. However, the young man awkwardly admitted that he simply did not expect the beautiful maiden to wake up so soon. The wise old man had told him earlier that she had very serious wounds, and it would take quite some time to heal from them. But Pei Yuhan explained with astonishing calm that everything happened thanks to the father of the young heir Mu, who stands behind the gentleman. After all, this person left a small curious trinket in her chambers, thanks to which she was able to recover much faster. Looking at the shattered glass shards, the young boy realized that, apparently, these were the remains of a lamp that absorbed souls. When he approached the shards, he understood that no spiritual energy was emanating from them anymore. Obviously, the mysterious woman had destroyed the art, causing him to hold a lasting grudge against their family. The valiant hero listened to this lie about the family, supposedly strictly following its ancient traditions, and truly, if the noble man had not had irrefutable evidence, perhaps these scoundrels would have succeeded in deceiving him. However, our chamber lord showed them a bundle of jade tablets, after which he loudly declared that this was the matter for which a man worthy of the deepest respect sacrificed his unblemished reputation, honor, and even his very life. Young Master Mu was deeply touched by how Lord Yi Nin spoke of his late parent. At that moment, the arrested realized the revelation. It was about the Prime Minister. Initially, they considered him a weak-willed man in their company, thinking they could easily take advantage of him, but they were terribly mistaken, for by his death he exposed them all to the blow of retribution. The head of the family at that moment continued to pretend with affected nobility that he had no idea what the valiant hero wished to tell him. Therefore, our lord publicly declared that for the sake of Great Zhou, the Prime Minister bravely endured all the humiliations that befell him in order to infiltrate their criminal group. All this was done to obtain the report that the nobleman held in his hand. At first glance, the clan seemed to be a family of respectable specialists, but in reality, they collaborated with immortal sects, and the crimes described on the tablets would have been worth 100 death sentences for their kind. Obviously, the townspeople who heard this were the first to understand. The Prime Minister was a member of the control chamber. They realized the truth. All this time he stood on the side of the common people. He abandoned the sense of justice for a higher purpose. Therefore, everyone immediately began to praise the Prime Minister, while his son, looking at Mr. Yi Nin, could barely hold back bitter sobs. In the end, unable to endure the mental anguish, The young man fell to his knees and began to thank His Highness for the displayed magnanimous kindness. However, Lord Enin lifted the noble young man from his knees, asking him to wipe away his tears and stop the thanks. His Highness did a small thing, only allowed people to learn about a man who must not be forgotten. If you look at the townspeople at this hour, it was obvious that no one sympathized with the Prime Minister more than them. The minister who remained steadfastly reliable regardless of the circumstances. And in the future, it is his offspring who will have to pave the further path of life. In the end, based on the obtained irrefutable evidence, the scoundrel was tied up by the members of the control chamber, and they went to the next family. Many villains tried to flee, but the control chamber caught every single one of them. When the guards led the crowd of criminals through the city streets, the simple peasants could not believe that Lord Ening had accomplished what was told. It was extremely gratifying to watch these cursed officials being arrested. The townspeople thirsted for the death of these people. They threw food scraps and rotten eggs at them, planning soon to even move on to cobblestones. At that moment, the servant bowed respectfully and reported to His Highness that they had checked all the information. They managed to capture all the people listed in the list compiled by the late Prime Minister. Now that their task was completed, they could go to the place of execution with a clear conscience. Such was the order given by the hero. Only now did the prisoners realize the full seriousness of the intentions of the head of the control chamber. They screamed in disbelief that for the sake of some peasants, he was ready to make enemies for himself in the form of the Jade Chamber, especially considering that after their execution, the executioner would leave no living place from the Zhou Empire. The hero almost laughed at their words and pathetic threats, making it clear that leaving such corrupt officials in place was a direct path to the country's destruction. Therefore, he demanded that they be silent and calmly accept the punishment of heaven for their deeds. Just by looking at such a determined ruler, Pei Yu-han understood. When it comes to immortal sex, they simply have no other choice. If they stop now, there will be no way back. She was sorry. If only there had been at least one brave man like our hero before, they would never have been defeated many years ago. By this time, many townspeople had gathered at the place where the execution would be carried out. Even the emperor himself was watching what was happening through his magic mirror. At this moment, Lord E loudly announced the order to bring the criminals to the square. They resisted, begged for mercy, so as not to be deprived of their lives. The Marquis screamed desperately, calling the nobleman a madman who wishes for the entire country to fall into ruin because of him. However, the valiant young man reminded that it was precisely because of them that the state has long been in decline. Now the Marquis tried to assure that if the ruler spared their lives, Great Zhou would become powerful and prosperous again as before, and perhaps the immortal sex would stop exploiting their country. However, Mr. Ening intended to take their lives precisely so that those who still believe in justice and morality could catch a glimpse of hope and see that the control chamber is still fighting for justice and equality. At this moment, the executioner had already raised his blade amid the cries of the crowd, thirsting for the death of these pig people who only knew how to profit from the suffering of others. By this time, even the nobleman had already thrown forward the sign with the order of execution. In the end, the executioner immediately beheaded those who treated other people worse than animals. Soon the emperor wished to discuss this decision with his close associate Liao Sheng. He supported the hero's decision, but warned that for Great Zhou to regain its greatness, it would have to overcome countless obstacles and hardships. It is even possible that the path they are about to choose will ultimately prove wrong. However, the emperor agreed with the hero's words. Great Zhou had long since declined, so he did not even see the point in making any last-ditch efforts. But the minister was confident that all efforts were by no means in vain. They could have applied their accumulated strength and resources to support Mr. E Nin on the path that the young lord chose. At that moment, the emperor saw in the mirror how people glorified the almighty lord, and many also longed to enter the control chamber, not fearing even death. And he saw how the sphere of fate suddenly began to shine with its bright light, showing that the fate of their state had been extended. The emperor realized that perhaps Lord E was indeed right, and perhaps the path chosen by Mr. E Nin was the one that would lead them to prosperity. However, Liao Shen asked the emperor not to make hasty conclusions. Today Lord Ye Ning stirred up a great many problems. Perhaps if they decide to defend him, they will face great troubles. Soon, a eunuch came to the control chamber where the noble E Nin was doing his work to report about the sage's garden. However, from ancient legends, the young ruler decision to the imperial palace. Even Kai Shangao then admitted that he did not understand such a decision. But the young man made it clear that there are things that cannot be explained. When the time comes, everything will fall into place. In fact, the valiant man simply wanted to die and return here as the emperor of the Upper Kingdom. Then all these people will understand his decision. The events moved to the Jade Chamber, where Lady Fan Qingsui was just training. The mentor reported to the girl that the arrogant Ye Ning loves to fight. If they do not give him a worthy resistance, everyone will think that the immortal sects fear him. Obviously, the beautiful Fan Qingsui, as a loyal disciple of her master, asked him to kill this impudent fellow. But as it turned out, at the moment her mentor was going through the most important stage of cultivation. The wise teacher could not waste his energy on some scum. However, the master sent a message to various immortal sects. The arrogant woman admitted that this time Lord Yi Nin had gone too far in his actions. This means that not only the representatives of the Jade Chamber will hunt him. When the immortal sects get rid of the audacious youth, they will use this chance to pressure the Emperor of Great Zhou. Perhaps the august ruler is a much wiser person than he appears at first glance. The way he looks after the noble lord is quite eloquent. Obviously, the cunning master understood better than anyone that Lord Yi Nin was just a small fry. They should control the Emperor himself. The immortal sects need to get rid of the seed of rebellion before it has a chance to sprout. Around this time, Liao Shen and the Emperor, learning about the valiant hero's refusal to go to the Garden of Sages, began considering assistance from the White Horse Temple. Soon the commoners whispered that the monks from the White Horse Temple were heading to the capital for a religious assembly. They decided on this course of action precisely because of the recent mass execution in the capital, and wanted to use Buddhist prayers to free the souls of the dead. Obviously, this news reached the ruler himself very quickly. This was something new. The nobleman did not expect that in this world there were also people practicing Buddhism. Faithful brother Tsai immediately explained that Buddhism began to spread after His Majesty ascended the throne. The doctrine originated in the state of Holo, located in the west. In size, the state is comparable to Great Zhou, but its lands are not as fertile, and spiritual energy is scarce. The inhabitants of this state believe they can ascend to the heavens through rigorous training. An increasing number of devoted followers of Buddhism longed to find the true meaning of Buddhist Dharma, so they began to travel to other countries as missionaries. Over time, Great Zhou became one of their main destinations. For some reason, His Majesty is deeply interested in Buddhism. That is why the august ruler invited Master Yuan Fang to the capital. In addition to building the White Horse Temple for them, the Lord also bestowed upon the abbot the title of protector of the state. Mr. Yi Nin was obviously surprised that their self-loving young emperor had quite a wide range of interests. Moreover, the valiant warrior was puzzled. If Buddhists are held in such high regard, why had he not encountered many of their followers? The devoted Ji assumed that the cause of everything was the overly profound philosophy of the teaching. Moreover, if the nobleman was interested in Buddhism, then fortunately, the faithful companion had some knowledge in this area and could briefly tell him about everything. In the end, 3 hours later, the devoted servant finished his story. However, Lord Yi doubted very much that the young man had told him the traditional Buddhist Dharma. But although the young man did not possess deep knowledge on this subject, his words were not a fabrication. Therefore, at this moment, our Lord realized why these people had no followers. The Buddhist Dharma of this world differed from their native one. Its core consisted of the most superficial parts of Buddhist teaching. At this time, the events moved to the very temple of the White Horse. The little student came to his master to discuss that His Majesty had sent a man to him again, and believed that the reason was to grant a new title to their monk. But as it turned out, the august ruler sent a letter in which he asked the wise abbot to protect one person. Moreover, if they can persuade this young man to Buddhism, then the hope that Buddhist Dharma can spread throughout the world will cease to be mere dreams. Soon the letter from the monk was in the hands of the noble gentleman. However, Lord Yi Nin had no idea why the monk, who could organize his own religious assembly, decided to invite him. The devoted Kai Xianggao revealed that Master Yuan Fan stated the massacre happened precisely because of His Highness. With his appearance, the valiant warrior will bring peace to the souls of the deceased. However, Lord Yi did not think that in his presence these souls would be able to find peace. The nobleman was more certain that the Marquis would die a second time from anger if he saw him praying. But the faithful companion revealed. The monk Yuan Fan also declared that he would free the souls of the warriors of the Scarlet Flame Army, as well as the souls of the Prime Minister and commoners who died because of injustice. And then our hero realized, since their goal was so great, in that case they really needed to attend this assembly. At this time, the mercenary leader learned that the valiant Yi Nin would be present at the religious assembly. This was an excellent opportunity to kill the daring young man. Of course, it was a pity that all this rabble, including the Marquis, died too early, and did not have time to pay them the reward, especially considering that their goal, the Lord Yi Nin, was a very sought-after and respected man. Everyone treated the noble husband as if he were the only ray of light in this world. That is precisely why the mercenary longed to be the one to extinguish that light with his own hands. The villain laughed ominously, understanding that anyone who followed this light would feel all the horror and suffering. After that, the scoundrel made it clear that tomorrow he would kill the valiant hero right before everyone's eyes, as promised. The next day, A huge number of peasants gathered near the doors of the White Horse Temple. Some uninformed people were surprised why so many had gathered to hear the prayers of an ordinary man from the state of Holo. However, the commoners explained that Master Yuan Fan possessed unparalleled strength. The wise abbot should not be underestimated. The power of these monks was at the level of immortals. However, the man felt that Great Zhou had produced a great many talented people who could not be compared to some pathetic state of Holo. But at that moment, in front of all the honest people, they saw a bright glow that even eclipsed the sun itself. After such a divine apparition, 5 monks appeared, chanting one of the most sacred mantras in Buddhism. Soon the holy men descended to the earth, and when their voices merged into a single choir, above them appeared the majestic silhouette of Buddha himself. Immediately the doubter realized the true power of these people and began to apologize for his bold words. At this moment, the commoners noticed that Lord Yi himself had also arrived, which means they definitely should not underestimate the Buddhist teaching. Our valiant hero, approaching closer, introduced himself as Yi Ninum, who was invited to the religious assembly, and the wise monk immediately greeted his brightness as a glorious officer. The holy man carefully looked at Lord Yi Nina, a man who enjoyed special respect among the common people. The abbot intended to incline the noble warrior towards Buddhism. At this moment, Lord Yi, the holy man, clearly understood that someone was going to attack the valiant lord. The treacherous abbot calculated that if the young man first faced some minor difficulties, it would only work in his favor to draw him to the faith. Somewhere at this time, a mercenary was wandering among the peasants, understanding that he would have only one chance to kill the hero. The villain simply had no right to make a mistake. The monk carefully watched this man, understanding that if he allowed Lord Ininu to feel the approaching death, it would make the noble man lean even more towards Buddhism. Pei Yuhan seemed to hear his thoughts, understanding what an idiot this fake monk really was. At that moment, a loud fiery explosion sounded behind the backs of the townspeople. Immediately they realized that something was burning near their houses and rushed there at once. All members of the control chamber became alert, believing that what happened was the work of immortal sects. However, Wei Wentong understood. If the immortal sects wanted to kill Lord Yining, they would have come straight here. They wouldn't bother with something like this. Our hero immediately ordered Wei Wentun to take people with him and find out what happened there. However, he did not want to act that way, as he had come here to protect the master. Those responsible for such incidents could deal with this. But the valiant warrior reminded that ordinary people were much more important than him. Here he would be safe, and if the Lord ordered Wei Wentun to go help, he must carry it out. However, even Kai Xiangao considered the elder brother's decision far too rash. But the noble young man insisted that immediately ordered the smug bald man to shut his filthy mouth. The holy man was greatly impressed by how persistent the master of virtue was, but warned that such persistence would not help him become the Buddha himself. However, the man, surprised by his words, explained that Buddha was the quintessence of all existence. There is only one Buddha. He would not even dare to think of such blasphemy. And then the thoughtful young man realized that in this world, Buddhism was quite different from what he had known before. In that case, our hero had nothing to fear. The valiant warrior mentally asked Yuan Fan not to blame him for what would happen next. After all, no one asked the treacherous abbot to subject the young man to such cruel tortures. At that moment, approaching with a sly smile, Lord Yi decided to ask the master a little about the ideals of the Buddhist sect. Of course, the man was surprised that the young man had so suddenly changed his attitude. He even thought that perhaps an enlightenment had descended upon the noble lord. Bowing in a respectful bow, the holy man made it clear that he could not call this the huge number of natural treasures. When the people of Great Zhou see foreign guests from poor lands, they are filled with pride. That is precisely why they are not interested in the master who arrived from a distant land for missionary work. Secondly, Buddhism seems too unrealistic. It contains too many prejudices and fantasies not supported by real experience, which makes it very difficult for people to accept it. And thirdly, the Buddhist sect was too hypocritical and narrow-minded, which greatly offended the cunning abbot. The scoundrel even demanded that his grace watch his tongue, and Lord Inin understood that the master was outraged. Then the nobleman decided to ask him one question. Since the Buddhist sect is not part of the common people, what right does it have to preach about salvation? This is literally equivalent to the usual shouting of various slogans. If the Buddhist sect is not narrow-minded, who can explain the mystery of why those who join Buddhism can only become arhats or bodhisattvas, regardless of how much they practice Buddhism? It was completely unreasonable that the followers cannot become the Buddha himself. Of course, the monk tried to justify this by saying that Buddha is unique. He is the quintessence of all existence. And indeed, the treacherous abbot encountered a discrepancy. After all, if all lives are equal, Buddha cannot be the quintessence of all existence. He himself began to wonder why no one can become Buddha, and how Buddha himself became who he is. Lord Nin, seeing his pensiveness, decided to reveal to the master the reason for it. It's all because the Buddhist sect preaches Hinayana, not Mahayana. The other followers were shocked that according to the valiant Nin, they practiced Hinayana, which is far inferior to Mahayana, where Hinayana means small wheel and Mahayana means great wheel. Some even rebelled, believing that Lord E did not understand what he was talking about at all, and immediately aimed their weapons at the hero. However, the guards of the control chamber stood up to defend the gentleman, demanding that the monks not even think of doing anything. Even Yuan Fan believed that the valiant Ye Ning insulted the Buddhist Dharma. However, the noble Ye Ning only stated that they practiced the wrong Dharma. But apparently, the monks were so stubborn that he was even allowed to tell the truth. In the end, in order to fully grasp the wise viewpoint of the hero, Yuan Fan pleaded to explain what Mahayana truly represents. And this very type of teaching states that any being in this world is free to become a Buddha. Buddhists do not save Buddhists, and yet those who seek Buddhism beyond their own body may never realize that understanding their own mind is also Buddhism. Buddha does not chant from morning till night, does not give endless instructions, does not break sacred vows, does not do good or evil. If the search for Buddha consists in comprehending the nature of living beings, and if the nature of living beings is Buddha, then the refusal to understand the nature of a living being will no longer be Buddhism. Since a monk himself can become Buddha, his disciples can also become him. In general, all beings of this world can achieve enlightenment, for Buddha dwells in the heart of every creature. In addition to this, the so-called Buddhist Dharma they practiced considers only one person, ignoring all other living beings, and this was Hinayana. The pious man's body trembled as he realized the truth. Anyone can become Buddha. It turns out that Buddha truly dwells in the heart of every being. Truly, if all living beings are equal, this means that anyone can achieve enlightenment regardless of their earthly status. And obviously, it will be easy for any person to believe in such Dharma. Their Buddhist sect asking the snake about what had happened. Lord E made it clear that everything happened quite the opposite. He felt that the Dowager Empress should not be feared. Pei Yuhan did not argue. The woman herself was nothing special, but the immortal sects that support her are a bad matter. And since today Ye Ninu is to attend a small banquet at the Emperor's palace, the little snake will stay with him a little longer. Soon our hero was walking to his comrade and heard the whispers of the servants of the control chamber regarding the poem he had written. At the same time, the nobleman very much hoped that the widowed empress would kill him, so that when he returned as the heavenly emperor, he could lift the curse from Prince Hun Wang. At that moment, in his office, Kai Xianggao was hiding with the poem, The Difficult Path, holding it like a true treasure. Seeing this, Enin also turned around and left, understanding that it was better not to take Kai Xianggao along, especially for some small banquet. Soon he found himself in the Garden of 100 Aromas, where he was met by a servant who once again escorted him inside. There they were already awaited by the Dowager Empress, as well as numerous officials sitting at their personal desks below. The nobleman was grateful that at least this time his own place was prepared for him. However, suddenly he felt some strange premonition. Goosebumps ran down his spine. Moreover, he had the feeling that today the Dowager Empress was looking at him differently. He felt the thirst for murder emanating from her. It seemed the woman was really planning to kill him. Moreover, there was neither the first candidate for the murderer nor the second fool here, and the members of the control chamber were waiting for him outside. This really was just a great opportunity for the Empress to finally kill him. Obviously, the Queen Mother saw how foolishly the hero was smiling and understood that this would be the last smile on his lips. After this banquet, he definitely would no longer be able to smile or breathe. Enin could not even imagine in his worst nightmares who was currently controlling the Dowager Empress. Therefore, the puppeteer on the other side knew that today the brave man would surely lose his miserable life. At that moment, the eunuch suddenly remembered the Emperor's order. He had strictly commanded to watch Enin's behavior, so that God forbid he would not start arguing with the Dowager Empress. Just at the moment when the eunuch was lost in thought, the other palace servants approached him. Obviously, the loyal servant was quite surprised, as the subordinates were supposed to be working in the kitchen at that hour, since the current day was marked by a magnificent banquet. However, bowing low, the man reported with the greatest respect that the members of the court, by order of the Dowager Empress, were preparing for the feast themselves, and therefore their help was extremely necessary. Of course, Eunuch Lu could not help but be struck by the fact that the widowed lady wished to personally prepare the banquet. This seemed an excessively suspicious act. Meanwhile, the events shift to the imperial kitchen of the Dowager Empress, where servants were constantly bustling about, and the managers watching them ordered to carry the dishes with special care, for negligence towards the sovereign was simply unacceptable. At that moment, the eunuch Liu was watching everything happening in the kitchen from afar. He had no idea why a certain manager was assigned on duty today. It seemed the previous one had long since left the imperial chambers. There was a sinister feeling that the intentions were far from pure, and not only because of the manager, for the loyal servant did not know anyone currently on duty. It gave the impression that the widowed empress had something sinister in mind. Moreover, when he tried to enter the courtyard, he was forbidden from doing so, being declared an unauthorized person who was not allowed to observe the ongoing feast. Of course, the devoted servant was extremely shocked that the other eunuchs did not recognize him and called him some stranger. Everyone was well aware of the eunuchs from the imperial stables, as well as the famous assistant of His Majesty. Then Eunuch Liu, using his high status, made it clear that he had arrived here by direct order of His Majesty the Emperor to serve the current guests. However, he was told that the Dowager Empress had strictly ordered that unauthorized persons not be allowed inside. But at that moment, the bold guards received a couple of sharp slaps from the senior eunuch to make them come to their senses. The loyal servant was extremely angry at the behavior of the men, who clearly did not understand the dangerous situation they had gotten into. After that, he reminded for the last time that he acts on behalf of His Majesty the Emperor, and all servants must clearly know who has the final word in the imperial palace. Looking at the back of the departing eunuch, the guards immediately began whispering about the best course of action. There were not many options, so they decided to report the incident to their superiors immediately. At that moment, the Empress warmly welcomed all the guests who had taken the trouble to make such a long journey to attend the feast on the occasion of her birthday. She wished for their efforts not to be in vain. At that moment, the officials noticed that the mistress was planning to present them with a divine drink. Immediately bowing low, they made it clear that spending such treasures on unworthy people like them was excessive extravagance, although they were undoubtedly filled with gratitude for such great courtesy. However, the ruler reminded those present that this wine was created precisely to be tasted. Moreover, considering the honorable status of the gathered, she was confident they deserved to try this precious drink. Yi Nin, listening to the speech, understood how obvious her treacherous plans were, but was glad that he would finally have a chance to become the heavenly emperor. At that very moment, the servants had already begun bringing in the very immortal wine and were themselves slightly intoxicated by its heady aroma. Of course, the manager was angry that this useless handful of servants was intoxicated by just a fragrance, so he immediately ordered to call another servant. But at that moment, the eunuch Liu who appeared behind him ordered everyone to stop immediately. It was not difficult to guess that the widowed empress had hired a steward specifically to serve wine to the ministers. There was definitely something wrong here. If the widowed lady truly intended to harm Mr. E, he simply could not remain indifferent. However, by intervening right now, he would thereby offend not only the manager, but also everyone present. The eunuch Liu was scared, which was natural, considering that he had been a cowardly weakling since birth. Since childhood, he had no friends. No one treated him with respect. They only mocked him and considered him a useless eunuch who even needed more time for laundry than others. However, Mr. E never despised him. Despite the fact that the loyal servant was a eunuch, the nobleman sincerely regarded him as a true friend. But he hardly deserved such treatment. After all, he had always been a coward from the very first day. But he was simply obliged to protect his friends. Therefore, the eunuch Liu decided to find out from the steward whether he had tried the wine that was going to be served to the guests. Of course, the manager did not like that the loyal servant suspected that poison might have been mixed into the widowed empress' wine drink did not meet his exquisite standards. The noble young man honestly admitted that it was indeed excellent wine, but the reason for his condition was that his heart was filled with anxious worries, preventing him from fully enjoying the drink. However, the empress only laughed, explaining to the guest that alcohol was created precisely to drown out human torment. But it turned out that the hero's worries were related to the fact that alcohol would only add fuel to the fire of his mental anguish. Officials were amazed by such wise words. They expected no less from a skilled master of poetry capable of shaking an entire state. Of course, given the fact that they were celebrating Her Majesty's birthday, and that they were allowed to taste such amazing wine, one of the dignitaries asked the hero to compose another poem for them. However, unfortunately, no matter how much the nobleman pondered, he did not feel any inspiration for writing on this day. The empress obviously believed that this was due to the divine drink simply not meeting his highest standards. Therefore, she immediately ordered the servant to bring out the drink made from 100,000-year-old flowers, specially prepared for Mr. E. Everyone immediately held their breath upon hearing what precious gift the widowed empress bestowed upon the noble hero. At that moment, the manager immediately ordered the servants to bring him wine, after which he looked back at the eunuch Liu, who at that moment was simply unconscious from the amount of alcohol consumed. When he saw the bottle of wine, images of the little children he had taken under his protection immediately flashed through his memory. With a heavy dare to touch him, they all had to know what this sacred sign was. If he broke this precious item, all the palace units would immediately arrive here. The manager was extremely surprised that His Majesty the ruler granted this thing to the eunuch. Perhaps the Lord of the Celestial Empire truly valued the life of Master Yi Nin extremely highly. The manager himself did not care about either Lord Yi's life or his own. The most important thing was that his family remained innocent. Realizing that the eunuch truly desired to taste this wine, he did not try to dissuade him. After all, he tried to help him, not believing that the nobleman had truly fallen lifeless to the ground. However, the manager quietly ordered the two of them to keep their mouths shut. At that moment, breaking through the crowd of servants, the hero ran up to the respected eunuch Liu. He immediately lifted the husband and began shaking him to find out what had happened. At that moment, the steward explained that they had been ordered to bring wine. The eunuch tasted it according to the sacred palace rules, but suddenly fell dead. Obviously, Mr. E immediately set to work on the husband to help him remove the poison from his body. However, the faithful servant seemed to feel that everything was already over for him, but he was glad that he managed to save the hero, be able to enjoy peace and prosperity. Unable to bear the pain, the hero shouted loudly, and the energy overflowing his body burst out in an instant. The officials who witnessed this scene began to stagger, not understanding who could have been so reckless as to try to poison someone in the sacred imperial palace. At least it was gratifying that these people only managed to kill one eunuch. At that moment, everyone respectfully stepped aside before the Dowager Empress, and the authoritative woman immediately ordered the Ministry of Punishments to investigate the committed crime. The lady herself was indignant in her soul, realizing that the hero had once again managed to avoid his demise. After that, she made it clear that she was tired today and asked everyone to disperse. However, the hero looked disdainfully at the Empress, making it clear that he would not let her leave without getting to the bottom of what happened. None of those present could escape from the crime scene. Of course, the royal mother was struck by the boldness of the hero, who even forbade her from leaving this place. Even the officials were outraged, not understanding why Yi Nin was once again crossing all the boundaries of decency. What was he even trying to achieve? At this moment, the sword of the dynasty's founder, which had been resting in the control chamber all this time, responded to the enraged hero. He immediately rushed to the blade itself, while it was making it clear to those gathered that it wished to restore justice for the fallen. This meant that regardless of who was responsible for the crime, he desired their death. And it does not matter whether it will be a minister, an official, or even the son of heaven himself. Of course, the widowed empress could not believe that even if the fault lay with her, A Ning really intended to destroy her. However, the noble young man directly decided to ask the widowed lady if she was in any way connected to this evil deed. But she just bared her teeth, looking the hero straight in the face, fearing nothing that this young man might do. And when she admitted part of her guilt, the hero made it clear that she must pay for her crime right there. The officials believed that Yi Nin had truly lost his mind, daring to threaten the return home. Carefully listening to the emperor's words, Yi Nin caught himself thinking that the ruler was giving him a rather strange look. He thought that maybe he had done something wrong, which immediately caused the hero's facial expression to take on the darkest and most uncertain features. However, when the emperor encountered such an expression on the young man's face, he immediately turned away, causing the noble boy to become completely confused both in himself and in the ruler. Very soon a smile returned to his face, as before, and the young lord decided to open the passage for the two heroes to the sage's garden. Placing both hands on the box, he began to mutter some kind of spell under his breath. At that moment, a huge golden dragon appeared in the middle of the sky, and immediately opened its mouth, aiming as if it wanted to swallow the ruler. However, in an instant, the dragon shrank to the size of a snake, and immediately swirled around the box in the hands of the young ruler. At that moment, an unprecedented column of bright golden energy burst forth from the very jewelry box. It hovered over the earth for some time, and thus formed a gate of enormous size. It was many times taller than even the imperial palace itself. After that, obeying the emperor's order, they began slowly opening their massive doors. Immediately after this, the young man began to be sucked inward. It felt as if they were traveling through the galaxy itself. For some time, Nin was completely unconscious in this void. However, very soon he opened his eyes but realized that he had no idea where he was. He, together with Kai Shangao, sat in the boat, which was steering them somewhere forward along the rocky shore. Fortunately, the young man knew the text of the tale perfectly. The Sea of Knowledge has no boundaries. Therefore, Kai Shangao assumed that they had ended up in this very Sea of Knowledge in the boat. According to rumors and legends, the water in the Sea of Knowledge was liquid scholarly qi. The young man was fully aware that if the ancestor who created the Sea of Knowledge were still with them, the immortal sex would not be so unrestrained. However, Yi Ning succinctly noted that due to the decline of Confucianism and Taoism, they would never know the true power of their ancestors. After that, he decided to ask his comrade if he had noticed that the rook had frozen in place and had not moved anywhere. Fortunately, Kai Xianggao had an explanation. According to legend, there were no waves in the Sea of Knowledge. They had to use their scholarly ki to move the boat forward. The first to take on testing this hypothesis was Kai Xianggao himself. As soon as he released his scholarly energy, the rook immediately moved forward unhurriedly. However, Yi Ning clearly understood that at the speed the rook was moving now, they would not reach the shore anytime soon. However, he did not say anything simply because he did not want to offend Kai Xianggao. Instead, he decided to try to help him. In an instant, he unleashed a part of his inner powers. A bright pillar of golden color rose to the very heavens. In the end, the rook rushed forward at such a speed that Kai Xianggao barely managed to cling to the seat of the rook to avoid being blown backward. Not much time had passed when they reached the shore, and Kai Xianggao, who was clearly seasick from such an extreme trip, realized it seemed his brother was not human at all. Still, he stepped forward and saw a building surrounded by golden light. This was sacred ground, and Kai Xianggao had never even dreamed of setting foot on it. Yi Ning clearly did not share the young man's enthusiasm. On the contrary, he was wary of the powerful energy lingering everywhere. He wanted to carefully obtain the source of life and preferably not do anything unnecessary in the process. Soon our travelers followed the winding path inside, leading them to unknown distances. At this momentous instant, they passed the first majestic statue, the great sage, to whom fate granted the talent to create the legendary 13 articles about Wenzhou. Upon seeing this stone shrine, the venerable Kai Xianggao finally realized in what sacred lands they might have heard the hero's words and agreed with them. However, Mr. Yi objected that this could not be, considering that these two were dead. Moreover, for some reason, he once again experienced the well-known feeling of betrayal. Perhaps they want to make him stronger again. At that moment, the sky under which they stood was covered with dark clouds, and long lightning bolts began to flash everywhere. As soon as they hit the pillars, they immediately lit up with a purple light. Kai Xianggao knew perfectly well that when the purple energy appeared from the east, it was a good omen. This phenomenon heralds the birth of a sage, and that means Yi Ning's words were definitely approved by the sages themselves. This is roughly what our hero expected. His body was already trained to recognize such moments on a very subtle level. At this moment, the great sages pondered the hero's words about the desire to ensure prosperity and security for the people and to continue the teachings of the sages. Immediately, all the lightning gathered into something resembling a purple portal, and this portal immediately tried to pull the hero into itself. He began to soar into the sky with incredible speed. It seemed he was about to reach outer space. However, at some point everything froze as if nothing was happening. Only Yi Ning remained, shining bright gold. Looking at him, the younger brother immediately realized that Master Yi had indeed managed to break the seal of Confucianism and Taoism, and he had also reached the level of a Confucian scholar. Two ancient enemies looked at the young man with pride, understanding how much had changed thanks to this one person. Moreover, they were glad that after such long years of disputes they would finally be able to break the chains that had restrained Confucianism and Taoism for many thousands of years. Immediately the wise men ordered the chains to break, and everyone supported their call. They controlled the body of the hero, clad in golden energy. And he himself with his own hands tore apart the chains binding the schools of Confucianism. And, looking at this moment, unable to hold back, Kai Xianggao simply burst into tears, realizing that his elder brother's actions could save all Confucianism and Taoism of this world. At this moment, bright golden pure scholarly energy began to seep from the very imperial palace. And looking at this, Pei Yuhan understood. Everything was done thanks to Yi Ning. Now the great power will be able to go through grand changes. At this moment, the officials stood behind their ruler, reminding that they had sworn to follow him, and the intimidation of the immortal sects had gone too far. They no longer saw any reason to tolerate this world, so they ordered the degenerates to return to their mountain. Immediately, the members of the control chamber grabbed their blades, ready to defend the great power even at the cost of their lives. The warriors of the empire itself also armed themselves, ready to accept any fight. Immediately, looking at this, the emperor made it clear to the uninvited guests that their country had already made its choice. The elder merely snarled discontentedly, making it clear that the emperor would surely regret this decision. However, at that moment, another old woman approached the edge. She praised the emperor for managing to deceive them all, but suggested that the ruler simply continue hiding somewhere, as he cannot be sure that their current forces are enough to defeat the immortal sects. However, the ruler understood that there was no point in any escape, for the person he was waiting for had already returned. The elder only concluded with some cunning smile that if Yi Ning had not interfered in the affairs of the immortal sect, perhaps their country would have lasted a little longer. After that, she loudly ordered her comrades to do everything to get the head of Yi Ning today. They had to kill anyone who stood in their way, showing no mercy. And immediately the entire gathered immortal sect declared a real war on them. And immediately, after the Emperor gave the battle signal, the gates of the Imperial Palace opened, and there appeared an army of valiant soldiers. First of all, the cavalry charged into the attack, rushing at their enemies. At this moment, other warriors on the walls of the Imperial Palace were already loading the crossbow cannons. In the end, mass firing from all the guns began at the ships, and the frightened peasants ran away to avoid getting caught in the shooting. At this moment, the ruler gave his subordinates the order to immediately take all civilians behind the palace walls. At that very moment, the first immortals appeared from the ships, surprised that the Emperor had indeed restored the Dragon Guard and even the mythical battalion. They even felt a bit sorry for the unfortunate ruler, as all his actions were useless. They would destroy them all to avenge Ininu for killing one of them. At that moment, seeing the silhouettes, the Emperor also immediately recognized among them the 4 ascended immortals. Even Pei Yuhan recognized at a glance that they were at the Tianshu level. There were several levels of cultivation. First, purification, then, foundation building, then, immortals, then, heavenly mandate, next, heavenly questions, Tianshu, and true immortals at the very end. At this moment, the immortal addressed his Imperial Majesty, making it clear that the 4 of them did not wish to mock the weak. The officials realized, in this war an unexpected variable had appeared, and it was not worth making such senseless sacrifices. It would have been better to retreat. But the immortals made His Majesty understand that they would allow him to leave. However, the others who rose up against them will have to stay here forever. With their divine palms, they attacked the land and almost hit their own spies who were working undercover in the Imperial Palace. One of these palms immediately rushed at the cavalry. Many people were killed in an instant along with their faithful steeds. The ruler ordered all the warriors to immediately return to the palace and not to worry about him, for the ruler knew that no one would dare to touch him. However, unexpectedly the immortal laughed at the ruler's foolishness. They had already given him too many chances, but he himself decided to stay. Therefore, the next divine palm was already directed towards the ruler. And everyone realized, with such assassination attempts, the 4 exalted ones were clearly overstepping. However, just when it seemed the palm was ready to crush the unfortunate emperor, a huge blade of divine light protected the man. Then before the immortals appeared a Tianshu-level priest. She was a young lady, and no one expected that such a powerful man would be on the side of the unfortunate emperor. Obviously, the frightened ruler immediately asked his aunt to retreat. However, the woman ordered the emperor to retreat with the others while she held off the enemies. In the end, officials and soldiers immediately began escorting the townspeople under the piercing gaze of the emperor. At this time, a ringing erupted in the sky from the unceasing battle. The ascended surrounded the aunt, making it clear that she could never defeat them alone, which meant that by opposing them, she had already signed her own death warrant. However, although the woman knew she would not be able to defeat them all, she was sure she could take a couple of immortals with her to the afterlife. At that moment, she attacked the immortals with her arrows, and they immediately retreated in fear, soaring into the sky. Only later did the elders realize that all this was nothing more than a trick of this woman. Taking advantage of this retreat, she was already rushing towards the imperial walls, and His Majesty immediately ordered his soldiers to help the aunt get to the fortress as soon as possible. The whole point was that the fortress was surrounded by an immortal barrier. However, the exalted immortals perfectly understood that such protection would not be able to stop them in their righteous anger. They decided to destroy the barrier protecting the city and burn it to ashes in retaliation for the bold resistance offered. Even the loyal disciples of the Exalted could not believe what they heard. It seemed utterly unthinkable to them to destroy the barrier erected by the great ancestors of the Great Zhou dynasty several eras ago. Not a single soul had managed to break through it all this time. However, the wise Ascended reminded the naive students that the great ancestors were no longer among the living, which means the barrier had considerably weakened. In the past, they could not destroy it. However, this did not at all mean that they would not be able to do so now. After that, all 4 combined their mighty forces and continued to fiercely attack the barrier in an attempt to crush it. At this moment, they cast a spell on some demon-like dragon. He rushed towards the golden barrier and clung to it with his sharp claws and strong teeth, like a hungry beast. Pei Yuhan clearly saw that the immortal ascended beings were methodically exhausting the barrier's energy with systematic attacks. Moreover, if not a single soul in this city can strengthen this barrier, its destruction will be only a matter of time. Mr. E had too little precious time left to provide assistance. At this moment, our valiant Enin was still trying to digest the fact that he had suddenly received approval from 2 junior sages at once. And then Kai Shangao joyfully shouted upon seeing a bright glow high in the sky. That was the star of Wenqi, one of the great sages of the past. This star could only mean one thing: Confucianism and Taoism have been revived. The guy could not help but rejoice in his soul, for this meant that today the millennial seal imposed on Confucianism and Taoism was completely destroyed. At this moment, the fluctuations of energy were felt by the exalted immortals, and they could not believe that someone had truly managed to break the seal that had restrained Confucianism and Taoism for so many centuries. In the sage's garden, high in the sky appeared a wooden plaque of the heavenly ruler. She descended straight into the hands of the young man, and he immediately caught her with reverence. Now, no longer hiding, the junior sages appeared before our hero, amazed that he had managed to gain the recognition of the very heavenly ruler. This meant that from today he became the owner of the Garden of Sages, as well as the master of all researchers. Kai Shangao almost lost his spirit when he saw that the junior sages themselves had appeared here, Master Cheng and Master Wang. The venerable elders themselves, smiling kindly, admitted that compared to Lord Yi, they had disgraced the title of junior sages and therefore entrusted the future of Confucianism and Taoism to the young man. They respectfully asked so that the young man would not refuse this burden, for they were merely two restless souls who had to pass their titles to the new generation. After that, the sage raised his hand to the very sky and a bright star instantly lit up above it. Immediately, a sign responded to this radiance, which was found in the noble youth, and the warm glow spread throughout the surrounding area. The sage could not help but rejoice that the young man had already managed to obtain the mark of the Wanxi star, for this would save them a great deal of time. After which the young gentleman's body began to change, acquiring a completely different majestic appearance. In the end, all his clothes were replaced with completely different garments filled with gold, rubies, and precious blue fabrics. Frightened by such a transformation, the young man immediately pulled back, and the clothes disappeared. The sage explained that it was the starry robe of the sage, with which our hero would receive protection from the sages themselves and be shielded from any spells. And then Mr. E realized that he had involuntarily become stronger again, even though he had not asked anyone for it. At that moment, the elder handed the young man a small golden statuette, shining with precious gold, which might be useful to him in the future. However, our noble Yi Nin firmly refused it. But it seems that no one took his opinion into account at all, because she instantly ended up behind the young man's back. Immediately, the frightened young man tried to pull her away from himself, letting the sages know that he did not deserve such a gift. Of course, this was all just a modest excuse. At this moment, the content younger sages realized that now they and their brother could finally rest in peace. Moreover, they congratulated the hero on the fact that even being so young, he had chosen a much greater path than these two had once taken. Therefore, they very much hoped that Mr. E could fulfill his noble ambitions and lead all the explorers, after which the two souls disappeared like morning mist. Our Yi Nin still couldn't say anything to them, while Kai Shangao was insanely happy to have met the youngest sages themselves. They were quite freedom-loving and left, leaving Lord E with a feeling of striving for greatness. The hero himself could not think of these old men any better than of the old tricksters, because of whom he became even stronger. He clearly felt that his strength had increased many times compared to his previous state. Hardly even the immortals from the sects would be able to withstand his newly acquired power. At this moment, the sinister dragon continued its attempts to break through the golden barrier. The defenders began to panic. The barrier was starting to fail, so they wanted to engage in battle, at least trying to distract the monster. But the Emperor, more than anyone else, knew that this was useless, and outside awaited only death. Thus, they would only add to the ranks of meaningless victims. Fan Qingsui mocked the bunch of nobodies who were merely delaying their own demise. She asked the residents to look around. Now they were fighting alone, despite the fact that they were defending Yi Nina, who was responsible for what happened. Fan Qingshu had no idea why people continued to resist and reminded them that a coward like Yi Nin did not deserve their loyalty. However, enraged by her words, the warrior immediately shot his arrow towards Fan Qingshui, ordering her to shut her filthy mouth. However, as soon as the girl gave the arrow the command, it froze, hanging in the air and never reaching its target. At this moment, the immortal elders ordered the assistants to put even more power into the created dragon, in order to eventually break through the barrier, even if it required using all the healing pills brought along. In the end, the dragon began to strike its head against the golden barrier with even greater force, trying to break through it. The peasants saw that a little more, and the barrier would not hold. This meant that they would all die. At that moment, the emperor gave the order to the warriors to prepare for a possible breakthrough of the defense. Obviously, they ended up in a situation where everyone will fight not for life, but to the death. At the moment when the warriors prepared to meet the battle, the elders ordered everyone to give their all in order to finally overcome this barrier. And indeed, not a moment had passed after his words when the first cracks began to appear on the golden barrier. Immediately after this, all members of the Immortal Tao rushed into the Imperial Palace to kill absolutely everyone. However, Fan Qingshui did not manage to warn her comrades in time about what she noticed in the distance. It was a huge multitude of golden shining pillars that appeared throughout the territory of the imperial palace. Many were endowed with extraordinarily strong energy of virtue. Immediately, the wisdom of our hero spread throughout the district, and everyone heard what he desired. Their consciousness was illuminated by the star of the empire's founder. Moreover, everyone felt how the research energy was literally calling out to them. Everyone felt how the chains that bound Confucianism and Taoism gradually fell away. This meant Confucianism was revived, and that means the sages have returned. Liao Shen could not help but rejoice that someone had managed to destroy the ancient chains for the first time. He suspected that the revival of Confucianism was surely the work of Mr. Yi, who had gone to the Garden of Sages. The emperor did not restrain himself and simply burst into tears of happiness, realizing that our hero had accomplished the task set. Pei Yuhan was also looking high into the sky at the brightly burning yellow star, foretelling great changes. It was Lord Ye Ning himself, who had finally returned from his most important mission. At this moment, the immortal elders began to understand why they felt the auras of Confucianism and Taoism. Apparently, several Confucian and Taoist rats still managed to survive in these dark times. However, the elder warned the unfortunate people that no matter what era they were in, neither Confucianism nor Taoism could save them from righteous punishment. He swore to destroy absolutely everyone, for when he said that the people of the empire would be wiped off the face of the earth, he was by no means joking. However, our valiant hero appeared in his path and challenged the old man to try to carry out his plan, if he dared. Obviously, the man flying on his divine blade immediately stopped upon seeing the power emanating from the hero, for he did not understand who this guy was. However, the elder clearly felt that something had gone wrong, for from the mere aura of the youth before him, his soul was thrown into turmoil. At that moment, the members of the control chamber rejoiced upon seeing the return of the chief officer. Even the simple peasants immediately chanted, "Hailing the honorable gentleman Yi 100 times. They rejoiced that the noble man had not abandoned them after all. He cared for them, and for this they were ready to stand by him until their last breath. Only after these loud welcoming shouts did the elder realize that the very Yi Nin was standing before him. Frankly speaking, he was surrounded by a rather frightening aura, but still all 4 old men decided to attack at once, believing that Lord Yi was deceiving himself by wanting to protect an entire city alone. Even the emperor panicked, realizing that things were very bad, so he ordered the soldiers to immediately assist the minister. However, Pei Yuhan quickly made it clear that their help would not be needed by Mr. Ye. The emperor doubted the woman's words, but she asked to just observe a little and see everything for himself. At this moment, the clear silhouette of our hero began to constantly change, illuminated by a bright light. At that very moment, the young man was already surrounded by the divine hands of the immortals, wishing to crush him like a worthless bug. But as soon as they dared to approach Ininu at an unauthorized distance, a loud explosion occurred, coloring the entire sky yellow-orange. The divine elders immediately flew away. That was how powerful the recoil was after that strike. They immediately realized that apparently Mr. E possessed some kind of magical treasure that reflected the full power of their attacks. And our hero looked at the old men as miserable rejects, who were not even worthy of a fraction of what the guy expected from them. However, the immortals demanded that the hero not become conceited, believing that he was strong only because of his treasure. Perhaps he could protect himself, but he definitely cannot protect everyone else. Therefore, they headed to the city to start killing and to provoke the hero. However, the noble young man understood that all these efforts were useless, even despite all their cunning and audacity. At this moment, our Yi Nin blocked the way to all the scoundrels who were trying in any way to harm the townspeople. Looking at all this, they realized he was a true researcher of Confucianism. What other person could possess such power? However, suddenly the hero's body was clad in armor, and his energy became even more noticeable. Then it became obvious. Such power and virtue are not inherent to an ordinary researcher. Moreover, the stamp imposed on Confucianism and Taoism was removed not long ago. However, Mr. Yi Ning managed to become such a monster in a very short period. The only option is that he broke the chains that had bound Confucianism all this time. At that time, the elders were not surprised that the young man had been absent for so long. It turned out he was in the Garden of the Wise Men, and now he was so strong that if they left him alive, they would face very serious problems. Fan Qingshu was furious, not understanding who gave this insolent person the right to resist fate itself. Literally, a nobody had no right to oppose people like them. At this moment, the elder ordered Fan Qingshui to request reinforcements from other sects as soon as possible. Given the current situation, they cannot defeat this guy alone. Therefore, they immediately ordered the members of the immortal sects to retreat. They had to wait for reinforcements and return again. Even the immortal elders were struck by the order to retreat. but understood this was the most logical option. Therefore, in conclusion, they only warned that they would definitely return to settle accounts with the young man for the deeds he had committed. However, our hero blocked their way, not understanding who these old men thought they were. They were clearly mistaken if they believed they were allowed to come and go here whenever they wished. Despite their battered condition, the members of the immortal sect believed that Lord E alone would never be able to stop their retreat. However, the hero decided to quickly change their minds when he began to summon the blade that had been polished for 10 years. These were words from the poem about the battle between Confucianism and Taoism. Right there, before everyone, a huge shining blade appeared. Seeing the light for the first time, at the mere sight of such a weapon of mass destruction, everyone realized they needed to flee immediately. But, unfortunately, they were simply not destined to run far, for with his energy of virtue, Yi Nin bound the old men, not allowing them to escape. After which he loudly declared that today, drawing his blade, he would show the immortal sects their place. At that moment, all the people on Earth noticed how their swords began to move, as if responding to the poem spoken by the gentleman. After that, the warriors calmly put down their weapons, and all of them ascended into the sky to the huge divine sword controlled by the hero. In the end, they all lined up in a row, obeying only the movement of the young gentleman's hand. Although it was late, the young man intended to wipe such miserable people off the face of the earth. The elders, looking at this, could not believe that someone like Yi Nin would really dare to kill them. However, the young man calmly noted that anyone would have done the same, given that they had rudely trespassed on his lands. After that, he attacked those old men who, using their last strength, built a protective barrier around themselves. One of them reminded that he is an elder of the Ascension sect. If Mr. E kills them, then everyone from the Ascension sect will hunt him for the rest of their days. Therefore, he suggested the guy simply let them go in peace, hoping that there would be no grudges between them. However, these words sounded almost like mockery, considering what they had done to their land, where many fallen people lay. And he reminded that if not him, then no one else would succeed in avenging those who fell today by their hands. The old man tried to explain that today only a couple of commoners had died, not worth making such a scandal over. However, our Yi Nin was furious that all these people thought they had the right to control other people's lives. After the hero's attack, 4 old men instantly lost their physical bodies, and their souls rushed to flee, hoping for salvation. However, even so, the righteous hand of Inina caught up with them, piercing right through. All this was observed from the ships by astonished elders accompanied by Fan Qingshui, and only then did Mr. E notice the ships behind, which had been trying to flee in fear all this time. Of course, armed with his blades, he rushed towards them. After that, he calmly reminded those cowards that he would not allow them to escape from the battlefield. Everyone on the ships immediately understood what was about to happen, so they tried to escape by fleeing. And our hero literally began to suck in the enemy ship with his virtuous energy, trying to destroy it along with everyone who was inside. However, an attempt was made to resist him, and once again the divine hand was directed towards him. But the sky was full to the brim with these palms. Looking at this, Pei Yuhan quickly understood. It was the work of the priests of the 13 Immortals. They all decided to act together to oppose Lord Ye. The ruler had no idea why the chief priests of the immortal sects decided to come into the light to kill just one person. Pei Yuhan also suspected that the physical bodies of those old monsters were far from this place. Perhaps they decided to manifest precisely because they sensed an aura that posed a threat to all immortal sects. It was about the great revival of Confucianism and Taoism. The frightened warriors wanted to know what to do now, for the great barrier protecting the city had been destroyed. And indeed, Pei Yuhan understood. A person capable of restoring such a barrier was needed. However, in the current situation, there was only one outcome. They all needed to flee immediately to save themselves. Moreover, Pei Yuhan asked His Majesty, even despite the sacred duty to protect the empire, to leave, for if the capital is destroyed, he will not be able to avoid death. When he looked back, he saw the lady in beautiful garments who offered him this cup of wine. The guy could barely contain his embarrassment at the beauty of the girl standing before him. At that moment, the awkward empress, whose title Mr. E did not guess, asked the boy to stop staring at her. And our hero really looked away, although he understood. The beauty herself was to blame for being born so attractive. Moreover, the young man did not need to be a super genius to understand that the girl near the palace, from whom the same scent emanated as from the emperor, was his concubine. Therefore, Mr. E barely restrained himself from showing disgust on his face right now. However, upon hearing what our hero was mumbling to himself, the girl decided to find out why Lord E was cursing His Majesty the Emperor. And then the guy, without hiding, admitted that in the past he considered that person a foolish ruler. And now it had become something like a habit that was hard to break. Then the lady decided to find out why Mr. E, despite acknowledging the emperor as his ruler, continued to constantly act against his will. And our hero pondered, not knowing how to answer this question. After all, he could not seriously say that this fool prevented him from becoming the Heavenly Emperor. He only tried to explain to the lady that she was mistaken. He had no intention of picking on the Emperor. He just constantly had a feeling of some kind of injustice, and whoever the person was, he could not remain silent. After that, apologizing, he decided to return to his chambers before his imminent departure. Only when drunk did he ask the beauty why her appearance so strongly resembled the imperial one. Of course, the Empress immediately became afraid that Mr. E might have seen through her lie. However, she tried to smooth over the situation, explaining that it was just a coincidence. The Emperor could not resemble some girl.